When the Beatles burst onto the world stage in 1963, they transformed popular music overnight. A commercial phenomenon like no other, they paved the way for every artist who followed in their wake.
They were selling vast amounts of records, a 250,000 a week. No one has ever done that before. You know, Elvis had them, Lonnie Donegan had them, every week selling 250,000 records.
You had a revolution just in terms of sales. But in addition to that, we wouldn't have had the Rolling Stones. You wouldn't have had the Byrds, you wouldn't have had Dylan going electric, you wouldn't have had the Doors, and all those other bands that we associate also with the 60s. The chances of them existing without the Beatles are pretty slim.
Yet the band's impact spread far beyond music. As figureheads for a blooming youth culture, their influence penetrated to the heart of the post-war world.
They were agents of change. They were carrying everyone with them. Everything felt modern, new, fresh. Everywhere you looked, the world started to look different. The colors started to really emerge, these green shoots of a new culture.
From the point of the Beatles' arrival, they completely reinvented how culture works. Suddenly, adults were growing their hair long. Grown-up women were wearing mini skirts. Suddenly, it was young people who were determining everything. That started with the Beatles.
By the second half of the 60s, the band transformed into leaders of the emerging counterculture. Bringing new social, sexual, and artistic ideas into the mainstream, through their peaceful revolution, they became the undisputed voice of a generation.
The Beatles were the most commercial band on earth, but they were also the most avant-garde and experimental. That was their role. Through their music, they opened up people's minds.
They helped to move a lot of people who might not otherwise have gone along with the stuff that happened in 66 and 67 and 68. They were inspirational and influential in that way. But as they became more involved in the counterculture and more representative of it, they became a political threat.
This film traces the Beatles' path through the most extraordinary decade of the 20th century. It reveals the lasting impact of four musicians from Liverpool who went from class warriors to cultural revolutionaries, while providing the soundtrack for a generation.
They were a catalyst for a great many things. They changed just about everything.
Great Britain, 1962. A small and once dominant kingdom finally recovering from years of austerity following the Second World War. A nation of discipline and order, of industrial cities and quiet village greens. And although outwardly it appeared stuck in the past, beneath the surface a fresh culture was developing that would rapidly transform it. At the close of the year, the UK was hit by some of the coldest weather it had ever suffered. Everyday life grinding to a halt as snow covered the country. Breaking through this bitter winter, on January the 11th, 1963, a record was issued that provided the first glimpse of the brave new world that was to come. Please Please Me, the second single by Liverpudlian four-piece The Beatles, quickly rose to number 2 on the British charts, and its mainstream success announced the arrival of a revolutionary force in both music and culture.
You don't need me to show why do I always have to say that? Come on, 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 please, please me, oh yeah, I got please you.
Please Please Me was a kind of an eruption. They took the blunt force of 1950s rock and roll, which was a blunt instrument. There's no other way to describe it. Musically and socially, it was a blunt instrument. And they grafted onto that the harmonies and the whole sort of plaintive vocal quality of the girl groups of the early 1960s. Nobody had ever heard anything quite like this before. This was a group that had two of the best singers of their era in the same group. And something like that I don't think had really happened before. The sound of John Lennon and Paul McCartney singing together is one of the great sounds in music of the 20th century.
Last night I said you went through my I know you never even tried.
They were a shock to the system. Love Me Do was the first single, and it was a bit of a false start. Please Please Me, it's when you had the unison sound of the band. They're singing, come on, come on. There's this sense of anticipation and a sense of excitement. It was a fresh sound. I mean, it sounds so traditional now, but at the time, the look and the sound was completely fresh. It was positive, uplifting, and modern.
The Beatles, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison and Ringo Starr, provided a much-needed shot in the arm to Britain's pop scene. Although American rock and roll had been enormously popular in the mid-1950s, its electrifying initial surge proved short-lived. With its major stars either selling out or disappearing from the scene, the musicians that came in their wake were more wholesome and less threatening. British artists followed suit, and the musical landscape in the UK was dominated by talented imitators and the teen idols of pop Svengali Larry Parnes. With the support of their manager Brian Epstein and producer George Martin, the Beatles offered something very different. Driven by the unique songwriting partnership of John Lennon and Paul McCartney, this band composed their own material.
Most of conventional English show business, as we think of it, was really a pale reflection of American show business. It had not always been the case, but since the war, certainly it was. You had singers like Matt Monro, who did an almost letter-perfect imitation of Frank Sinatra. By the same token, you had the famous, facile, fatuous English pop stars of the period, of whom Cliff Richard was by far the best known and most successful, who was a kind of third-rate version of Elvis, and not of the Elvis of Heartbreak Hotel, but of the Elvis of King Creole, the Elvis of Elvis the movie star.
We're all going on a summer holiday. No more working for a week or two. Fun and laughter on a summer holiday. No more worries for me or you for a week or two.
It was pretty professional. Cliff Richard and the Shadows were good players. It was a good act, but it was family friendly. And you had also characters like Larry Parnes with his stable of pretty boys who did what they were told, who sung what they were told to sing, and who had no particular creative input at all. So when somebody like the Beatles comes along, and they're not only playing their own instruments, singing beautifully, they're also singing their own compositions. This was incredibly rare at the time.
The Beatles were keen from the start to write their own material. They wrote the songs to the audience, to address the audience. They knew that the audience was 80% teenage girls, and they wrote songs that elicited the perfect response from them. And after that, the deluge followed. It sent the signal out to everybody that you can all write your own song, get a slice of the action. Within a year or two, all bands are writing or having a crack at it.
It wasn't only the extraordinary sound of the Beatles or the unique talents of Lennon and McCartney that were revolutionizing popular music. As they came to dominate the charts in 1963, their string of hit records transformed the commercial fortunes of the British record industry itself.
As the Beatles became more popular and every record seemed to sell more and more, you had a revolution in the British record industry, just in terms of sales. They'd never seen anything like this, both in the amount of sales and how long the Beatles would hang around in the charts for months and months and months. In addition to that, there was the rolling impact of hit after hit after hit that never let the quality drop. If anything, the quality increased from Please Please Me to From Me to You, which was a little more downbeat but was no less wily, and then Between the Eyes, She Loves You, which explodes out of the radio to this day.
lost your love when I saw her yesterday.
People like Cliff and Billy Fury and Elvis, you know, they were selling quite substantial amounts of records, you know, per se, but by beginning of 1963, you know, Please Please Me and From Me to You and the Please Please Me album, they were selling vast amounts of records.
No one's seen anything like this in the pop industry before. I mean, this was suddenly a happening industry that not only young people were taking notice of it, but the bean counters too. So you had everyone scouring Birmingham for the Moody Blues, the Hollies in Manchester, and Liverpool, of course. All the scouts were up there looking for the next Beatles. Everyone wanted a slice of the action because they'd revolutionised the music industry in just a matter of months in 1963.
But the group's impact was not merely confined to the musical world. They also both represented and inspired a seismic shift at the very heart of British society. How these four young working-class Liverpudlians managed to spearhead such a change lie in the Beatles and the country's past. In the 2 centuries before the Second World War, the United Kingdom had led the Industrial Revolution and had ruled over the greatest empire on earth. One of the foundations behind this superpower was its class system, which both divided and ordered its citizens. After emerging victorious from war in 1945, the elite class in this system, known as the establishment, which included the monarchy, the aristocracy, and the heads of all the major institutions governing society, immediately tried to reinforce their power. And this chain of command would once again shape life in Britain during the post-war years.
Britain was a very class-ridden society. We are a nation of subjects, not citizens. And as long as you do have a royal family and a set of lords and ladies and the whole hierarchy of privilege, then obviously someone is going to be at the bottom. After the war, the establishment obviously tried to reassert itself. So you still had the old sort of Christian values, for instance. You know, nothing happened on a Sunday. Even children's swings in the parks were chained up on Sundays. The 60s really was the first time that anyone really kicked a hole in any of that and started to challenge all of these traditional assumptions. Really, it was the same group of middle-class people who assumed that they had the right to tell everybody how to live. We're still very much in power.
Yet Britain's power was waning, and its empire slowly crumbling. Almost bankrupt as a result of its war effort, the years of hardship that followed saw the entire country suffer. The north of England in particular struggled to recover, and the once dominant port city of Liverpool, heavily targeted by German air raids, was beset by widespread damage and disappearing industry.
During the 19th century, the North sort of developed this kind of proud sense of itself. The port of Liverpool was the greatest port in the world because England was the greatest commercial nation in the world, and everything, or most things, came in and out there. But over the course of the 20th century, England went through a phenomenon that is now very familiar to Americans of the late 20th century, which is the decline of industrialization, the decline of manufacturing. By the 1940s, it was very clear that Liverpool was in decline. As a result, the Beatles generation grew up in this place that was filled with the emblems of imperial might, but which was becoming a very dire place to live in many ways.
Everywhere there was a debris. The street was full of bomb buildings. All the kids used to play in the buildings and deserted places. The debris was still going 20 or 30 years later, you know. There was no money about, and it was very hard. What did young people have in Liverpool to look forward to? Everything was closing down. All the factories were closing down. It was pretty tough times in Liverpool in those days.
And it was within this stark landscape that the Beatles grew up. The band's founder and eldest member, John Lennon, was the product of a broken home and was raised by his aunt and uncle in a fairly affluent area of the city. His future bandmates, Paul McCartney and George Harrison, however, both came from working-class neighborhoods. Despite the dereliction surrounding them and the hard times in which they were raised, the future prospects of all three were given a boost by a new educational initiative, that saw the brightest children enrolled in grammar schools, whatever their financial background.
John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison took an examination when they were 11 years old that essentially certified them as clever. And as a result of passing what was called the 11+ exam, that meant that they were eligible to go to grammar schools. Grammar schools were designed to educate children in order to go on to some form of higher education. What this meant was that at a relatively early age, at the age of 11, particularly Paul McCartney and George Harrison, whose origins were truly working class. John Lennon was a bit more complicated. John was a little betwixt and between. But in the case of both Paul McCartney and George Harrison, at the age of 11, they were somewhat isolated from the world of the housing estates that they had grown up on. Every day they took the bus into the center of Liverpool to go to a place called the Liverpool Institute. And they were essentially marked and educated from the age of 11 to transcend their working class origins.
With far better schooling than their parents, these future Beatles were a new breed, raised within the proud Liverpudlian working class, yet unfazed by the educated elite supposedly above them. And with the coming of rock and roll in 1956, a musical form exploded that spoke directly to their youth and their sense of difference. It was the following year that John Lennon met Paul McCartney and invited him to join his band, the Quarrymen, with George Harrison joining shortly thereafter. All around them in Liverpool, a new phenomenon was finding its own rebellious voice. The teenagers had arrived.
The 50s became the era when teenagers really came into their own. We were together in our love of the music. Up until that time, a young lad would be taken to the pub for his first pint when he turned of age by his dad. He'd dress like his dad. He'd go into the union of his dad and go in the same work as his dad. With the girls, she was in the kitchen learning how to make the breakfast, do the cleaning, all the rest of it. But suddenly, the youngsters were now earning money and they wanted to spend it their way and do their things and not be told what to do.
A generation gap was opening up, and this would dominate cultural life in Britain across the next decade. And while rock and roll resonated with young working class Britons, other American influences, from the beat poets to jazz and blues, were embraced by middle-class teenagers. If the future Beatles were at heart rock and roll rebels, none of them more embodied this than John Lennon. But having failed his exams in 1957, he found a place at the Liverpool College of Art, where he was thrown into an unfamiliar bohemian student culture. Although this would prove vital in expanding his talents, here Lennon was an outsider.
I first met John Lennon at the College of Art. I was sitting down in the sort of canteen, and suddenly I noticed this guy walk past. And I thought, what's he dressed up like? Because he was dressed almost like a teddy boy, and a completely unconventional type of dress compared to all the other students. And I looked around, and everyone was wearing duffel coats and turtleneck sweaters. I thought, oh, they're all wearing the same, they're all conventional. He's the rebel, he's the one who's different, I must get to know him.
If you were in art school in the 1950s, you would have been exposed to the intellectual radicalism and rebellion of figures like Jack Kerouac and the Beat Generation, who were anti-established religion, pro-self-expression, anti any kind of establishment repression. And the angry young men of theatre, John Osborne, Arnold Wesker, these guys were angry, but they were clever. They found a way of directing their anger, which may well have been a kind of personal angst, but when it's directed to the outside world, it can create a great articulate voice of a generation, if you like.
954. 950 bloody 5. I could get through in half the time if I went like a bull, but they'd only slash me wages so they can get stuffed. Don't let the bastards grind you down, that's one thing I've learned.
This sort of influence would have been very appealing to someone like John Lennon, who was himself an angry young man for all kinds of personal reasons. But if you could be an angry young man and thoughtful with it, then that's very appealing.
By the summer of 1960, the school days of John Lennon, Paul McCartney and George Harrison were over, yet they were quickly thrust into an education of another kind. In August, the band, now calling itself the Beatles, headed for a season of shows in the vibrant German city, Hamburg. And over the following year, it was here that they earned their stripes as a rock and roll band. Upon their return to Liverpool in 1961, they quickly rose to the very top of the city's music scene. Yet they were isolated in the north, and the rest of the country paid little attention.
I started writing to papers like the Daily Mail saying, what is happening in Liverpool is like New Orleans at the turn of the century, but with rock and roll instead of jazz. But of course, no one was interested. So I decided to do it myself and created Merseybeat. And of course, my friends, John and the group he formed, the Beatles, were the main people I wrote about.
With a teenage audience hungry for information about this new rock and roll scene, Bill Harry's Merseybeat music paper proved a huge success in the north of England. Celebrating the Beatles in almost every issue, it brought them to the attention of one of its contributors, local businessman Brian Epstein. The manager of a Liverpool music store, through Bill Harry, Epstein arranged to see the band play at the city's legendary Cavern Club and was blown away by their performance. He immediately offered to manage the band, and by January 1962, a contract was signed. Wary of the controlling approach of managers like Larry Parnes, Epstein was still conscious of the unwritten rules of the British entertainment industry. If the Beatles were going to change the world, they'd first have to change their look.
What I think he had was the instinct to realize the general overall sort of pattern of how things worked in this country. They were the savage young Beatles dressed in black leather and playing rock and roll to prostitutes, gangsters and all the rest of it in Hamburg, taking drugs and all the rest of it. They were the savage young Beatles. They would never have been accepted by the established media.
And the Beatles' breakthrough in early 1963 confirmed that Epstein's instincts were spot on. He had successfully smuggled a unique band of rebels into the heart of the mainstream. Yet unlike the controlling managers that dominated the British entertainment world, he then simply set them loose. From the moment they soared to the top of the British charts, the press, radio interviewers and television presenters came face to face with the Beatles. And these quick-witted, confident and very modern young men chose to play the game by their own rules.
In the beginning, the Beatles' behavior with the press was the most revolutionary thing about it. Nobody of their age group, and to a certain extent of their background, had ever behaved this way with reporters before.
Do you know you look like Matt Monroe? Give us a Russia with love. Thanks, boys.
The Beatles were just audacious. When they were being interviewed, they kind of turned the tables. When Adam Faith or someone like that was interviewed before, it was very much, you know, kind of a master and servant kind of thing.
Cliff, what sort of tour did you have?
Oh, well, I can honestly say it's been probably the most pleasurable one we've had for some time, mainly because not just the audiences, but because we've had a few hours off and we've been swimming and sunbathing and things.
The Beatles just ripped into that and almost ridiculed the whole thing, turned the whole thing into a Marx Brothers farce, which was fantastic.
I hear anyway that the four of you are going to be millionaires by the end of the year.
Oh, that's nice.
Have you got time? Have you got time to actually spend this money?
What money? He said.
Doesn't he give any to you?
No. Can you see that car of his?
It was very, very close to the way groups of male adolescents interacted with one another as a matter of course. This is what teenage boys and do. They try to top one another. They try to cut one another down, all of this sort of thing. The Beatles simply had the nerve to take this thing and to sort of perform it in front of microphones and cameras.
John, there's a rumour in the news of the Beatles paper that you might be leaving the group.
Rubbish. I'm
Absolutely.
contracted. Been trying to get out for years.
You've been writing some poetry.
What paper?
A paper called The News of the Beatles.
Never heard of it.
Do you want to see it?
No.
Must be American.
Part of their success came from the fact that they were not plastic, they were authentic. They came out of a fairly tough city, and they were just being themselves, and that was astonishingly, that was new. To actually be yourself was new.
By presenting themselves genuinely, the Beatles managed to highlight the mannered, stilted exterior of British cultural life at a time when it was already showing signs of weakness. Polite society's attitude to all forms of behavior, in particular sex, had been prudish and stuffy for centuries. But by the early 1960s, things were changing. At the beginning of the decade, the novel Lady Chatterley's Lover was successfully published. Withheld from the general public since the late 1920s, this erotic tale of love across the class divide became a phenomenon upon its release, quickly selling over 3 million copies. At the same time, a scandal erupted at the very heart of the British establishment, with the exposure of an illicit affair between politician John Profumo and a 19-year-old model. The uptight sexual attitudes of the British were being confronted in public, and then Beatlemania happened. By the summer of 1963, the band's overwhelming effect on teenage girls was becoming a nationwide epidemic. Their critics warned that the Liverpudlians had unleashed a wave of sexual frenzy in their female audience. Yet the liberation that the Beatles offered these girls was more complicated than it first appeared.
What everybody wanted to think and also didn't want to think was this was somehow all about eroticism. This was all about sex. And what was going on here was that these young women were having something that looked like it simulated a sexual experience in response to the Beatles, the sight and sound of the Beatles. And therefore it was always talked about and written about in the Freudian terms of hysteria, which of course is a sexually charged term also. Were these girls orgasmic? Was this orgasmic? That's not what was going on.
With rock and roll in the 1950s, that was a catalyst for a lot of young men finding a reason to be something other than a version of their dad when they became adolescents. And it wasn't necessarily fabulously articulate to dress as a teddy boy and be a bit rowdy on the street, but at least it was finding an identity. And I think for a young female, it wasn't quite as straightforward. Something like Beatlemania, the screaming that surrounded the Beatles, it's quite tempting to interpret it as a sort of howl of frustration as they try and find their own identity. And it's as inarticulate in a way as teddy boys rampaging in cinemas.
Do you deliberately try and create this sort of screaming reactions?
No, we just, arrive at the theatre and they're always there waiting. And whenever we're doing a show, the police always come and say, don't look out the window, because you excite them.
These girls were controlling public space, and nobody could do anything about it. It's a perfect example of what we would call bad behavior. Screaming, yelling, weeping in public, this is bad behavior in one way or another. And yet it was sanctioned, not by the authorities, but by the Beatles themselves.
The Beatles phenomenon was unstoppable. At the end of August, the single She Loves You became the fastest-selling record that had ever been released in the UK. In less than a year, the band's success outstripped that of any artist who had preceded them. And the final stage in their conquest of Britain came on November the 4th, 1963, when for the first time the Beatles came face to face with the highest order of the establishment, the royal family. The occasion unleashed the rock and roll rebel in John Lennon, who saw in the night's performance an opportunity too good to pass up.
John, in this royal variety show, when you're appearing before royalty, your language has got to be pretty good, obviously. This thing about Ted Heath saying that he couldn't distinguish.
I can't understand
the
Teddy.
Queen's English.
I can't understand Teddy saying that at all, really. I'm not going to vote for Ted.
But you're not going to change your act just for the Lord Privy Seal.
Oh, no, we'll keep, the same kind of thing, won't we?
Oh, well, yes.
Yeah, that's right.
Lennon always had an ambivalent relationship with how the establishment, the entertainment establishment, were cozying up to the Beatles. On the one hand, the professional in him loved the fact that they were being fantastically successful, but the rebel in him found it all hard to take. And so on the occasion of the Royal Command performance, he teased Brian Epstein by suggesting that he was going to go up and swear in front of the Queen. But in the end, his professionalism won out. He managed to create a little bit of subversion, but it was very carefully thought through.
For our last number, I'd like to ask your help. Would the people in the cheaper seats clap your hands? And the rest of you, if you just rattle your jewelry.
This is sort of like a moment of insurrection, it felt like. But the thing is, it wasn't quite as radical, perhaps, because you look at Lennon's face after he says it, and he sort of looks as if he's just admitted to his mum that he's messed himself, or something like that. It was something really humble pie. You know, he felt quite sheepish. But no one else but John Lennon would really come out and even have the gall to say that. But what may have seemed a kind of a revolutionary, insurrectionary moment by saying, rattle your jewelry, in a really class-driven moment, was actually punctured by this sense that the Beatles were nice boys and they can get away with anything.
With the youth of Britain in their thrall, the Beatles headed out to new territories, travelling to Scandinavia at the close of the year and then on to France. The domestic pop scene that they left behind had been transformed by their success. And from Liverpudlian acts like Jerry and the Pacemakers to London's The Rolling Stones, new groups were emerging on an almost weekly basis to battle it out in the clubs and on the charts. The Beatles were moving on, however, with manager Brian Epstein's sights set firmly on the largest territory of all, America.
Looking forward to this American trip. Have you had any reaction over there? You got any fan clubs going? Is there
Well, there's one supposed to be started, and they're getting quite good response, you know. Yeah. 12,000 letters a day.
But the Beatle movement's going over there.
Yeah, you can even be a Beatle booster, folks.
Yeah. I must tell you, by the way, that Detroit University have got to stamp out the Beatle movement.
No,
yeah,
we've got to stamp out Detroit.
They think your haircuts are un-American.
Well, it was very observant of them, because we aren't American, actually.
There was always that thing, well, what happens next? Is the beat bubble going to burst, you know? Yeah. But it never did, it just kept going on.
If Britain was suffering a particularly harsh winter when the Beatles had first set the charts alight in early 1963, when their single, I Wanna Hold Your Hand, reached America the following year, it entered a nation grappling with far greater misfortunes. Having emerged from the Second World War as one of the world's two superpowers, the following decade had been dominated by the country's hostile relationship with the Soviet Union and the threat of a full-blown nuclear war. But Americans themselves were enjoying the fruits of a flourishing economy. A strong consumer culture had developed, and domestic confidence was running high. In 1960, President John F. Kennedy came to office, a young, charismatic politician who embodied this new confidence and who promised a bright and optimistic future.
My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man.
3 years later, in November 1963, his assassination shook the country to its core.
There was this injection of energy into American life that he represented. You know, he was young, he was handsome. It represented such a marked change from Dwight Eisenhower. I mean, Eisenhower was a carryover from World War II. Obviously, he was a war hero. He was an extension of that generation into modern America. But John Kennedy was modern America. All of the optimism and youthfulness, the baby boom was going on, you know, was kind of epitomized by John Kennedy. And the Kennedy assassination just ended that. The Beatles represented also youth, just as John Kennedy did, and wit and intelligence. Certainly for young people, it turned things around immediately. The Beatles just lit America up.
I'm sure it could have been something else. I mean, I'm sure that some other joyful manifestation of something could have occurred. But what occurred was a song. And it's really important to realize in Britain, the Beatles' personalities, their repartee, their whole public performance was a critical part of the way that they came to the attention of the British public. In America, it was a song.
Oh yeah, I'll tell you something. I think you'll understand. And I say that something. I wanna hold your hand.
It was the perfect vehicle to come into this traumatized national atmosphere. What is a dominant quality of the sound of John Lennon and Paul McCartney singing together? Joy. Joy in performance. Joy in listening to one another's voices. Joy in whatever kind of reinforcement is going on here. That's painting with really broad strokes. There's nothing subtle about that.
There is no question the Beatles changed everything immediately. And I Want to Hold Your Hand made a gigantic impact. And then, of course, I mean, the floodgates opened. And not only with one great Beatles song after another, but, you know, the British invasion. I mean, the Beatles just knocked the door down.
What the Beatles had done to Britain, they were now doing to America. Released at the close of 1963, within 2 months, I Wanna Hold Your Hand had sold more than 1 million copies and became the band's first #1 single in the US. A week after they topped the charts, John, Paul, George and Ringo crossed the Atlantic and arrived in New York City to greet a new set of screaming teenage fans. They were also met by members of the press keen to understand this foreign phenomenon, and the group introduced them to their unique brand of informal humor, as rare in America as it had been in Britain.
There's no question that the way they dealt with the press was original. It was quite clear that they were not like anything else. How smart they really were, how funny they were. I mean, John and Paul in particular were extremely intelligent, articulate, original people. And George was also a very droll guy, and Ringo was sort of a natural clown who was just that quick, that smart, who was a pop star. I mean, I must be forgetting somebody, but damned if I can think of who it would be.
Do you think of your records as funny records?
No,
music,
not really. It's funny and peculiar that they should be hits after such a long time.
Do you feel they're musical?
Obviously they're musical because it's music, isn't it? Our instruments make music, and it's a record, even
It's musical.
Classical. Musical.
It's music, isn't it?
That's music.
It's good. He knows music.
All right, but what do you call it? Do you call it gospel, rock and roll?
We don't. We try not to define it because we get so many wrong classifications of it. It's no use. We just call it music. So even if you don't.
With a question mark.
Pardon?
With a question mark?
No, we need
No.
physics.
With an exclamation mark.
The underlying message of the Beatles' wit in their press conferences was about a youth movement that wasn't going to be determined by old people. From the point of the Beatles' arrival, they completely reinvented how culture works. Before that, everything, fashion, movies, music, it all was top down. It all was, what grown-ups liked, and then it filtered down to the kids. After a year or two, suddenly it was young people who were determining everything. That started with the Beatles.
Having broken all previous sales records in Britain the year beforehand, by April 1964, the band made Billboard Hot 100 history by becoming the only act ever to occupy the first 5 positions on the chart. The 4 Mop Tops were now revolutionizing popular music in America too, and Beatlemania spread like wildfire throughout the country. And then, in July, following the time-honored career trajectory of all post-war popular entertainers, the band starred in their first full-length feature film. Yet A Hard Day's Night was, unsurprisingly, unlike anything that had preceded it.
It's been a hard day's night, and I've been working like a dog. It's been a hard day's night.
Music movies before A Hard Day's Night were profit-making ventures intended exclusively for the teen audience of, whatever artists happened to be in them. A Hard Day's Night just kind of flipped that. They took what was a toss-off form, the rock movie, and made it something great.
Directed by American Richard Lester, the film created an entirely new language for rock and roll cinema. Previously, musicians had all made their transition to the big screen, playing fictional characters created by screenwriters. In A Hard Day's Night, however, the Beatles played themselves in a comedy inspired by their own experiences of fame. It was both a commercial and a critical phenomenon.
They're playing themselves in a sort of a fictional film. That didn't happen. So much of what happened in the early career of the Beatles hadn't really happened before. They were breaking through on so many different levels.
Tell me, how did you find America?
Turn left to Greenland.
Has success changed your life?
Yes.
I'd like to keep Britain tidy.
Are you a mod or a rocker?
No, I'm a mocker.
Oh. Have you any hobbies?
As I see it, it's really A Hard Day's Night that establishes them as something completely new and interesting beyond your wildest imaginings.
I don't snore. You do, repeatedly. Do I snore, John? Yeah, you're a window rattler, son. It's just your opinion. Do I snore, Paul?
With a trombone hooter like yours, it would be unnatural if you didn't.
No, Paulie, don't mock the afflicted.
Oh, come off it. It's only a joke.
It may be a joke, but it's his nose. He can't help having a hideous great hooter. And the poor little head trembling under the weight of it.
This was not the rock and roll movie that you were expecting to see, not at all. And although their wit had always been clear, they were always funny on the microphone, its irreverence, and its irreverence about themselves, was just completely unprecedented. And of course, it just made them seem even more godlike.
And while the Beatles embarked on a substantial US tour in the summer of '64, back in Britain, the whole country was evolving in their wake. Following the sex scandals of the previous year, the nation had turned against the establishment and voted in the Labour government of new Prime Minister Harold Wilson, a man who seemed to represent the voice of a younger, more progressive United Kingdom.
Harold Wilson actually became leader of the Labour Party around the same time that the Beatles were just having the first stirrings of huge success. He was Northern, let's not forget that. So this was, again, part of this big Northern powerhouse. You had the Beatles on the popular culture sense, and then you had Harold Wilson, who was reflecting modernity in the political sense. We're thrusting into a new world. We were behind Europe in the 50s. The Tories had let us down. He wanted to, let's get modern, like the Italians, like the French, like the Germans, let's get working. And let's make everyone enjoy the fruits of the success.
And central to this new progressive Britain was its youth. The staggering international success of the homegrown pop scene had injected the younger generation with confidence. And boosted by the country's growing prosperity, a new consumer culture emerged. Fresh from the breeding grounds of the art colleges, the modern ideas of Britain's budding designers were unleashed. This was nowhere more apparent than in fashion and its nerve centre in London's bustling Carnaby Street.
This was the first time that young people had enough money to buy records, to buy clothes, to have their haircuts. Out of that, almost immediately came a separate youth market. Carnaby Street thrived. Up until that point, when a girl left school, she immediately began dressing like her mother, whereas someone like Mary Quant made dresses that you could run in, and you could dance in and do stuff that young people do. And of course, that transformed the whole face of British fashion.
Everything felt modern, new, fresh. Everywhere you looked, the world started to look different. The black and white of the early Beatles and pre-Beatles, even with the Beatles all in black and white, even Hard Day's Night was in black and white. Within a year, the colours started to really emerge, the green shoots of a new culture.
Although they had played the central role in cultivating this new cultural landscape, by late 1964, the Beatles themselves were growing weary of their 8 days a week fame. In an attempt to escape from Beatlemania, both John Lennon and George Harrison had moved to rural Surrey, 30 miles from the centre of London, and Ringo Starr would join them there the following year. In December, Beatles for Sale, the band's fourth studio album, was released, and it clearly showed signs of fatigue.
You only have to look at the cover. These are young men exhausted, really, by a couple of years of Beatlemania. It was just obvious that they were becoming worn out, and that the incredible appeal of early fame, which they just rode that like a wonderful wave, and you can see and feel the joy in the records and in the interviews. By Beatles for Sale, it's losing its luster quite quickly.
Yet the onward march of youth culture would soon revive the band. While the kaleidoscopic colours of Carnaby Street were in full bloom, a more experimental subculture was developing in West London, the leaders of which would soon cross paths with the Beatles. Inspired by avant-garde literature, art and music, this loose group of artists and artisans lacked a sense of community. In June 1965, however, Barry Miles, the manager of renowned independent bookshop Better Books, arranged a momentous poetry event at London's Albert Hall, featuring Allen Ginsberg and other leading American beat writers. It was of huge significance, uniting the various creative clans of an emerging British counterculture.
The big poetry reading at the Albert Hall in '65 was, I think, the first time a constituency was seen in London. Up until that point, the actors and the poets and the filmmakers and the people who ran boutiques, none of them knew each other. At this event, which was basically a Beat Generation reading of Allen Ginsberg, Lawrence Ferlinghetti and Gregory Corso, all of these people came together into the Albert Hall, 7,000 people. The whole thing was a giant party, and it was really like the first sort of mass networking session, I suppose.
At this pivotal event that he had helped organise, Miles met John Dunbar, an artist friendly with both Allen Ginsberg and Gregory Corso, and who had recently married young singer Marianne Faithfull. Together, they planned a new centre for underground activities, the Indica Bookshop and Gallery, and this would bring Miles directly into the Beatles' world.
We went along to the Albert Hall, and a friend called Paolo Leone kind of went, "Oh, you should meet this guy," who Miles worked at Better Books at that point. And so we got chatting, and I don't know how many people it holds, the Albert Hall, a couple of thousand, 5,000, I don't know. Anyway, we kind of thought, well, look, everybody's paid £1 to see this, so maybe we could do a shop.
We decided to combine forces and start a bookshop art gallery combined. His best friend was a guy called Peter Asher, who at that point was in Peter and Gordon, a little rock and folk duo who had #1 hits, in fact, in Britain and America and Japan. And so Peter had some money, so naturally we looked to Peter to finance this venture. And so consequently, we started a company called Miles, Asher and Dunbar, MAD. I got to know Peter, of course, through this. And he was living at home with his parents, and also living at home was his sister, Jane Asher. Jane was a TV personality. She interviewed people. She was a child star in films and a lot on the radio. Also living there was Jane Asher's boyfriend, who was Paul McCartney, who was living on the top floor in a little attic room next to Peter's room. So there was this extraordinary household that I got introduced to. And when I was setting up the bookshop, we had all the books delivered to the basement there because we hadn't found any premises yet. And obviously through that, I got to know Paul as well. He would come in late at night, browse through the books and just leave me a note saying what he'd taken. So he was my first customer, in fact, in the bookshop. And when we did find some premises, he helped put up the shelves and paint the walls. So he was very, very involved with the whole project. And it was wonderful to get to know him.
While his bandmates had fled London in favour of the quiet suburban life, through his contact with the progressive art world, Paul McCartney soon became the most cultured of the Beatles. Where John Lennon had been married for years and was raising a young son, George Harrison had moved in with girlfriend Pattie Boyd, and Ringo Starr was a newlywed, McCartney was actively pursuing fresh sounds and fresh concepts, with Miles as his avant-garde guide.
In his own words, he used to go around London with his antenna out, One day he would go to see, a John Cage concert or a Luciano Berio or some electronic music. And then next day he would go and see Tessie O'Shea at the Talk of the Town, and then, or some Torch singer down at the Blue Angel. I mean, it was all being sucked in.
McCartney was very much the culturally aware Beatle about town, while the others went into a slightly cozier existence in the stockbroker belt. He was still curious, he was still hungry for any stimulation. It's around this time, 1965, 66, that McCartney really begins to drive the Beatles. He hung around in London, being stimulated, and bringing all of that back to the Beatles' table, and continuing to give them, an artistic edge.
That artistic edge would prove unmistakable when the Beatles headed to the studio in mid-1965 to record the album Rubber Soul. Across the previous year, the wave of bands inspired by the Beatles' example had not only begun to catch up with the Liverpudlians, but in some cases threatened to overtake them. Following Lennon and McCartney's lead, the Rolling Stones had managed to break America and had begun to write their own hits. Folk icon Bob Dylan had gone electric and transformed into the preeminent poet of rock. And new bands were emerging, from The Who to The Byrds, introducing fresh sounds and perspectives. Yet the Beatles were ready to pave the way once again. In pursuit of total creative control, with Rubber Soul, producer George Martin booked the band into Abbey Road Studios for an entire month, turning conventional recording rules on their head.
Before Rubber Soul, a professional recording day was overseen by recording engineers in white coats, and there was 3 hours in the morning, a break for lunch, and 3 hours in the afternoon, and that was it. That was your recording day. When Rubber Soul came along, they had enough clout to say, we want a bit more flexibility than that. We might want to stay on and record into the night.
They invented the idea of treating a record album as if it were a work of art. It takes time to do anything that's worthwhile. So you had this new idea, the idea of the recording studio as compositional laboratory. This was this incredible, real revolution, not just how to make records, but how to make music.
There are places I remember.
Rubber Soul looks like the moment when pop music could become popular art. The whole album had a sense of being an artistic statement. Brian Wilson himself of the Beach Boys said, when I heard Rubber Soul, I knew that's how good pop records could be. They could be a whole artistic world. That's how good Rubber Soul was.
Is there anybody going to listen to my story? All about the girl who came to stay. She's the kind of girl you want so much it makes you sorry. Still you don't regret a single day. Ah, girl, girl.
John Lennon is suddenly writing lyrics like, was she told when she was young that pain would lead to pleasure? Did she understand it when they said that a man must break his back to earn his day of leisure? Will she still believe it when he's dead? I mean, that's in a song called Girl. Those aren't pop song lyrics. That gave Rubber Soul just a very different feel.
You could hear that they were actually writing songs as artists, not just as pop performers. So you had songs like The Word, which is an extraordinary song for 1965. Say the word and that word is love. You know, this is 2 years before The Summer of Love. The despair of Beatles for sale, and there they are now reaching out for something that they've picked up on something else.
And just as Rubber Soul re-established the band's musical superiority, the four young Northern radicals were officially recognized by the British establishment. Having already received the highest accolades from the entertainment world, in October 1965, they were invited to Buckingham Palace to meet the Queen. Here they would be anointed as members of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, or MBEs.
This has been one of the talents of the establishment for a very long time. In fact, this is what the MBEs and knighthoods and all sorts of things like that were all about. That at a certain point, renegades need to be brought into the fold. But it's at that very moment that they now, because they were always importing musical influences, but they also become a conduit for imported American influences in these other fields that they're getting interested in. Miles is turning them on to Ginsberg's poetry. Robert Fraser is turning them on to American pop artists, things like this. They become citizens of the world. And so it's perfectly appropriate that at that very moment, the British establishment should say, time for you to come to Buckingham Palace and be certified as representatives, as members of the British Empire.
John, had you met the Queen before?
No, first time.
What did she think of you in the flesh? Did she tell you?
No, she's not going to say either way, but she seemed pleasant enough to us, made us relaxed.
Oh, now you've got this, do you feel that you're becoming part of the establishment, as it's so called?
No, don't feel any different. I still feel just like before.
You feel exactly the same. You feel exactly the same.
It was a recognition that the pop world had come of age. They were the aristocracy of the pop world, of pop culture, of working class culture. And so it was sort of inevitable in a way that they would be rewarded in the spirit of the new sort of democracy. But also it closed a chapter because from then on, they went off and did it their way, which wasn't the establishment's way. In fact, it was the beginning of a period of great antagonism with the establishment and pop culture. And the Beatles, as usual, were pretty much at the center of that.
The Beatles' position at the center of these new developments in youth culture was crucial to their evolution over the next 2 years. With McCartney now closely affiliated with key players in London's underground artistic scene, and with similar movements in both New York and Los Angeles influencing American musicians, the stage was now set for more radical ideas to enter the mainstream. And as these were developing, a new drug and a new figurehead were gaining prominence on both sides of the Atlantic.
The message is very simple. 6 words. Turn on, tune in, drop out.
Psychologist Timothy Leary had emerged in the US as a prominent spokesman for the hallucinogen LSD, or acid. Having led psychedelic experiments at Harvard University since the turn of the 60s, and with beat poet Allen Ginsberg a key early supporter, by 1965, Leary was becoming a major countercultural figure.
Tim Leary was a psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, psychotherapist. He claimed, I think, to have something like 7 PhDs. He was a professor at Harvard who began working originally with psilocybin before he got onto LSD as a way of treating prisoners and treating mental illness. I mean, the thing is, Leary was very much part of the establishment. He'd worked right across the normal lines of psychiatry. But of course, when he started to take all these things, he contacted his own self on a cellular level, and he realized that an awful lot of this was game playing and rubbish. And so he basically felt that this was in fact a spiritual key that he'd been handed, and that his message really should be to encourage people to leave the establishment and find themselves creatively or spiritually.
And the newly appointed MBEs, the Beatles, were already on their way to leaving the establishment and rediscovering themselves through hallucinogens. John Lennon and George Harrison had been introduced to LSD in early 1965 and had been joined by Ringo Starr for their second experience with the drug later that year. Combined with Paul McCartney's newfound interest in experimental art through his London social circle, the world's most commercial band were ready to take a very unexpected detour.
They wanted to discover who they were. They had no real sense of who they were, I think, anymore. So they're picking up the pieces, putting it together again. How the hell did they make sense of the Goldfish Bowl life that they'd been thrown into? From playing at the Casbah in Liverpool and the Cavern to being feted all around the world and just seeing themselves reflected back, people getting pieces of them everywhere, not knowing really who they were. And I think that was the engagement of pop culture, represented by the Beatles, with the counterculture, which was growing in confidence, and the fact that the two started to join forces in London, in San Francisco, they sparked off each other.
And it was at the close of 1965 that McCartney drew the ever-skeptical Lennon out of his Surrey sanctuary and introduced him to the underground world of Miles and the Indica bookshop and gallery.
One day, very shortly after we opened, Paul McCartney showed up with John Lennon, and I think it was the first time John was ever in the shop. And he was looking for a book by Nietzsche, and I just did not know who he meant. It took me maybe half a minute to figure out it was Nietzsche, and that was just enough time for him to get quite irritated and think I was being this middle-class university type, putting him down. And then Paul had to do his usual role of sort of calming everyone and said, no, he went to art school just like you, and it's just because you didn't know how to say it, did you? You know. But in the meantime, I remembered we had only just the day before had a big shipment of The Psychedelic Experience by Tim Leary. John curled up on the settee with it, and literally in Tim Leary's introduction, before you even get to the text, it says, turn off your mind and relax and drift downstream, or however the lines are, that finally showed up in only about a month later in Tomorrow Never Knows.
This song would be the most innovative composition of the band's career to date. Alongside Lennon's Leary-inspired lyrics, Paul McCartney's contributions to the track were equally radical. Having joined Miles at a number of avant-garde electronic music events, the Beatle had begun enthusiastically working on his own experimental compositions, using loops of recorded tape. As the Beatles entered the studio to begin producing Tomorrow Never Knows, George Martin invited McCartney to bring these to the sessions.
He had produced a whole load of them and brought them into the studio just in a plastic bag. They arranged the studio so that there were different tape recorders in different parts of the Abbey Road studio complex. And I was in a room with Peter Asher, and we were playing quite a long loop, which entailed holding a jam jar, and the loop went around the jam jar and then past the playback head and then over to, we had to keep it in tension. And I think there were 8 or maybe even 10 of us around the building, all standing, holding pencils or jam jars, and all of this information was going into the deck. And George Martin was just sitting there with his headphones, and whatever he did, of course, it's impossible to ever reproduce. That was it, that was the master, as soon as he pressed record. When I heard the playback, I mean, it was astonishing, actually. I thought, good God, you know, this is the future.
The studio was an instrument. Once upon a time, it was just this almost invisible console that was just there to absorb what was being played on the floor. Now it was actually being used as an instrument, and it was more important than individual instruments in a way. This was unprecedented. And the other interesting thing about Tomorrow Never Knows, it was the first recording for Revolver. It was done in April '66. I mean, this is extraordinary. Tomorrow Never Knows is undoubtedly the most psychedelic song recorded at that period. There's nothing else like it. I mean, the word psychedelic wasn't really in popular parlance at all. It was the title of a book that John got from Indica Gallery.
Tomorrow Never Knows is definitely the world's first psychedelic track. The interesting thing is, of course, the Beatles were not only the world's most commercial band, but at that point they were also the world's most experimental band, which is very unusual.
That became clear when the Beatles' follow-up to Rubber Soul, Revolver, was issued in August 1966. Alongside Tomorrow Never Knows, the album's tracks were brimming with invention and originality. If Rubber Soul had suggested that pop music could be art, Revolver confirmed it.
Revolver really was the Beatles moving towards the fifth dimension. She said, I know what it's like to be dead. The Beatles, Lennon singing about, I know what it's like to be dead. What the hell is going on? Well, they'd been partying with birds in the West Coast and dropping acid by then. Drugs, we have a very negative view on them now in that you can be imprisoned by them. But in the mid-60s, I think, people felt it was the opposite. It was to loosen the chains of imprisonment, this single view of who you were. And then suddenly you had perspectives. And Revolver, you can hear it with all the different production sounds. It was all altered states and perspectives.
The idea was basically to turn rock and roll into a legitimate art form. And I think they did it. So many of the things they tried, from feedback and reverse tapes and sitars, whatever they did, all over the world, other bands immediately tried out. I mean, they were tremendous leaders. Brian Epstein was concerned that they were going too far ahead of their fan base. But they were very, very sensible at that. They always wanted to bring the fans along with them. They didn't want to become some kind of wild avant-garde band that only 150 people heard of.
Epstein's fears that the band would start to lose some of their audience were unfounded regarding their musical output, but would prove accurate in terms of their politics. With the Beatles' compositions expressing a more complex worldview, journalists began to ask them more significant questions. In a series of landmark interviews for British newspaper The Evening Standard, the individual band members were quizzed over their thoughts on current affairs. Lennon's frank opinions on Christianity proved uncontroversial upon their publication in Britain, yet when they were reprinted in America, the first scandal of the Beatles' career erupted, with a single quote becoming instantly infamous. "We're more popular than Jesus now."
First time anybody had asked John Lennon questions about his life and his philosophy, and it just passed without. But months later, one of those teenage magazines just printed that "We're bigger than Jesus," which caused a lot of problems. A lot of problems. Death threats and records being burnt and broken and smashed, and the Ku Klux Klan and concerts being cancelled. And it was very unpleasant for everyone.
Well, originally I was pointed out that fact in reference to England, that we meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time. I wasn't knocking it or putting it down, I was just saying it as a fact.
Lennon's, the Beatles are more popular than Jesus line, which even to me as a kid, I could see what he was saying. He wasn't saying, it's what he said in his quote unquote apology. Like, I wasn't saying we're better than Jesus. I wasn't saying it's good or it's bad. It's just it's true. And to me, it was absolutely true. It was unquestionable. There was such a backlash against them. It made you aware of some of the fault lines in American culture, or made you aware once again that what seemed maybe like a unified culture really wasn't. And it was harsh. It was scary.
These fault lines in American society had been growing since the early 1960s, and where the civil rights campaigns for racial equality had most clearly exposed these divisions earlier in the decade, by the mid-1960s there was no issue more pressing or more polarizing than the Vietnam War. Since the US entered into the conflict in 1962, it had provoked widespread public opposition and organized protests both in the US and across Europe. The underground movement McCartney had become involved in had itself emerged from the early 60s pacifist movement in the UK, and by the time of their 1966 US tour, privately both he and his bandmates were opponents of the war. As they traveled across America, already battling controversy, the ever-honest Liverpudlians came under fire once again when they made this position absolutely clear to the press.
In 1966, the war was without any question much more on people's minds in America than the Beatles. 1966 was the year the war exploded. 1966 was the year that the number of draftees more than doubled in this country. 1966 was also the year in which the war really got terrible in Vietnam itself. It wasn't just, it was a bigger deal all the time. There was more destruction going on.
At the height of American involvement in Vietnam, they had 550,000 troops in that country. That's a lot of young people. There was a draft in the United States. The war had come home in a big way. It wasn't an abstract issue in any regard. And youth representatives, like the Beatles, people who were part of youth culture were expected to take a stand on it.
It seems to me you've always been successful because you've been outspoken direct and forthright and all this sort of thing. Does it seem a bit hard to you that people are now knocking you for this very thing?
Yes, Richard. It seems very hard. It seems hard, you know, free speech.
But is it possible just to say what you think all the time? What about 14-year-old teenagers who think you're absolutely marvellous and can't bear to be heard?
See, we're not, when we say anything like that, we don't say it older people seem to think to be offensive. We mean it helpfully, you know, and if it's wrong, what we say, okay, it's wrong, and people can say, you know, you're wrong about that one. But in many cases, we believe it's right, you know, we're quite serious about it.
But do you mind being asked questions? For example, in America, people keep asking you questions about Vietnam. Does this seem useful?
Well, I don't know, you know, if you can say that war's no good and a few people believe you, then it may be good, I don't know. You can't say it too much, though, that's the trouble.
It seems a bit silly to be in America and for none of them to mention Vietnam as if nothing was happening.
They were the first band to be asked about politics, about Vietnam, about a whole number of social issues. And in fact, I mean, although Dylan came a little bit before, as far as I know, he never once ever came out in public against the Vietnam War. So maybe the Beatles were the first there in terms of a very well-known band.
And it cost them a lot. There were then teenage girls in the South and the Midwest who didn't like the Beatles anymore.
I think the Beatles are a real talented group, but I think that they need to watch what they say because they're in such a position that a lot of teenagers really think of them as something really big, and when they say things like that, some teenagers are going to just believe anything they say.
In 1965, the Beatles were universally beloved. Nobody didn't like them. They were just wonderful and funny and creative and unthreatening. As they became more involved in the counterculture and more representative of it, they lost a lot of that belovedness. They helped to move a lot of people who might not otherwise have gone along with the stuff that happened in 66 and 67 and 68. Without any question, they were inspirational and influential in that way, but they also lost a lot of people. They became part of what many people in America, probably a majority of people in America, regarded as a disturbing loosening of values and morals and a political threat.
And at exactly this point, the Beatles ceased operating as a traditional band. Upon their return from the US, they announced that they were abandoning live performance, with the final show of the American tour their last ever paid gig. And then the most photographed celebrities in the world simply disappeared from the public eye altogether.
Hey, can I have a word? Are the Beatles going to go their own ways in 1967?
They could be, you know, on our own or together. We're always involved with each other, whatever we're doing.
Could you ever see a time when, in fact, you weren't working together?
I could see us working not together for a period, but we'd always get together for one reason or other. Like, I mean, you need other people for ideas as well, but, you know, and we all get along fine.
Will you
Rumours of a breakup began to circulate. Yet, away from the spotlight, the four Liverpudlians were hard at work on their most ambitious production to date. The public would have to wait for months before the Beatles reappeared. And when in February 1967 they finally did, both their image and their sound had undergone a startling transformation.
Strawberry Fields, of course, was originally intended as part of the Sgt. Pepper sessions. But the press kept on saying, you know, are the Beatles finished? They've disappeared, you know, they've run out of ideas, not realizing, of course, that they were working on one of their greatest achievements. And to me, obviously, it wasn't unexpected because I was at some of the sessions. But I think to the public, it came as quite a shock.
Let me take you down, 'cause I'm going to Strawberry Fields.
Strawberry Fields Forever was something else again. It was the Beatles had gone weird. I mean, that was basically what people felt. What is wrong with them? That's, let me take you down, so I'm going to Strawberry Fields. And the voice, it didn't sound like Lennon. Well, that's because they'd slowed the voice down. Nothing sounded normal on that record. The whole production, everything was kind of up in the air, put through effects. And then there was a video that was made at the time as well, shot in Sevenoaks or somewhere. And it was the strangest thing. You had Ringo as if he was disembodied. They were falling out of trees. There was nothing like that at all.
Living is easy with eyes closed. Misunderstanding all you see. It's getting hard to be someone, but it all works out. It doesn't matter much to me.
It had more in common with Salvador Dali and the Surrealists and Dada, all these highfalutin art kind of ideas, which was once the preserve really mainly of the educated elite. But this is the Beatles now bringing it to everybody.
This short film for Strawberry Fields had a seismic impact because it showed that they had traveled a distance that, well, you know, I felt it kind of incumbent on me to then travel as a young person who believed in that. It was like, wow, okay, this is what's being asked of me now. You know, it wasn't just, oh, that's, you know, they look cool. It was, all right, this is the path.
And that path became even clearer as the year progressed. By the turn of 1967, the counterculture was gaining momentum, with huge numbers of youths gravitating towards its new mecca, San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district. From here, a strong musical scene was developing, headed by psychedelic bands the Grateful Dead and the Jefferson Airplane, and word spread of a new phenomenon, the hippie. In the UK, the underground's influence expanded, with its own newspaper, the International Times, a live music club, UFO, and emerging stars the Pink Floyd and the American Jimi Hendrix. Into this blooming scene of peace, love, and mind-expanding drugs came the Beatles' most ambitious work to date, one which would not only capture the essence of this new sensibility, but also transform the record industry once again. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Presented as a work of art, with a single concept unifying the album as a whole, it announced that the age of the traditional pop single and the pop band was over.
Sgt. Pepper revolutionized the record industry. All of a sudden, albums sold as much as singles. Sgt. Pepper sold in the millions. On pure business terms, it was a revolutionary release. But also it was revolutionary in terms of letting the record industry know precisely what it could sell. What you could do is invest in the finest artistic minds of a generation and give them the freedom to make their art, package it up as an album, and sell it in the millions.
Paul had this idea of, we want to get away from being the four mop tops and the Fab Four, so we create this new name for ourselves. We're going to be a different group, and that'll give us the freedom to do what the hell we want. That is the basic concept. The songs, many of those songs could have been on any of the other albums. It didn't really, you know, they weren't specific to that particular one. But the influence of it was staggering. The Beatles were a force to be reckoned with. I mean, even the Stones were badly affected by them at that point. Everyone just had to deal with them. They were like a roadblock. You know, if you were in the music business, you just had to deal with this great big thing in front of you and get around it the best you could.
Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. I mean, the title itself was a piece of art and something that mystified people. Peter Blake did the cover, and Peter Blake was the father of British pop art. Everything about Sgt. Pepper was an enigma. The fact that they were pretending to not be the Beatles, but to be another band. The lock groove at the end of side 2, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, LSD, secret messages all the way through. It was like a work of literature, you know, it's like a Ulysses or something where people were just thinking, I don't quite understand this, but there's definitely something really going on.
This combination of imagination and mystery proved irresistible. With Sgt. Pepper, the Beatles transformed from pop culture icons into mystics of the modern age.
When the Beatles came out with a new song, people started pondering it. These are people that you're looking to for meaning.
By '67, I think the release of Sgt. Pepper in America established the Beatles basically as the leaders of the counterculture, along with a few other people like Allen Ginsberg, Timothy Leary. But the Beatles were the musical leaders right across the board. I mean, they were seen as, yes, as gods. I mean, Leary himself said a lot of silly things about them as the type of new superheroes, you know, leaders of men and all this stuff.
I'm not convinced that the youth culture in the mid-60s were terribly aware of LSD and Timothy Leary and even counterculture attitudes. If it hadn't have been for that conduit that was the Beatles, this sort of stuff might have just stayed in San Francisco, in California. The counterculture wasn't called the underground for no reason. Not many people knew about it.
Yet the Beatles were determined to spread the word even further. At the end of June 1967, less than a month after the release of Sgt. Pepper's, the band were invited to represent Britain in the first ever international satellite television broadcast. Across the US, Canada, and Europe, the youthful optimism of the counterculture was reaching its peak during the Summer of Love, with thousands flocking to large public events. With their historic contribution to the One World broadcast, the Beatles delivered the scene's definitive anthem to an audience of over 500 million viewers worldwide.
The Beatles, true to form, national representatives representing their country, they start with the national anthem. The only problem is, it's the French national anthem. You know, I mean, that's a classic. That is total Beatle humor.
It was fun. I was at that one. It was like a party. They'd invited a load of their friends, you know, the Small Faces and the Rolling Stones, and everybody was there, all in our psychedelic finery. Sitting on the floor there, it just looked like it might all explode at some point. But and there was an awful lot of sort of frantic waving and people rushing around, we were holding onto their headphones and talking to people. That was mostly to do with the international link-up, though, because no one had ever done that before. It really did go out live all around the world. It was fantastic.
This is mere weeks after the release of Sgt. Pepper. Every other band would choose to use that moment to promote Sgt. Pepper by doing a couple of tracks from it, right? It just makes total business sense. But they took the opportunity to send a message to the world that all you need is love. They'd already been saying it on Rubber Soul, the word is love, but this was the time they could tell the whole world all at the same time. The Beatles are clearly leading the way. I think there's a great significance in the idea of them sitting on those high chairs with the beautiful people of London, including Mick Jagger, sitting at their feet, looking up at them and singing along to a song they've only just heard. You know, that's powerful.
All You Need Is Love was an anthem of hope from a youth movement certain that the old order was about to crumble. The Beatles were steering an entire generation into uncharted territory. Yet it would not take the establishment long to respond to these peaceful revolutionaries. In the UK, the police were mobilized and began to make a number of drug busts, arresting not only prominent figures on the underground scene, but also Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, and later Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones. These high-profile cases didn't faze Paul McCartney, however. Following the arrests, he not only paid for, but also put his name to a national press advert calling for the legalization of marijuana. Weeks later, he admitted to a journalist that he had taken LSD and repeated this in a television interview, much to the shock of Brian Epstein.
Brian didn't like things being made public, you know. He was a very private person, you know, obviously because of his way of life. And the thing is about drugs, it wasn't anything about them being good or bad, it was illegal.
Paul, how often have you taken LSD?
About 4 times.
And where did you get it from?
Oh, you know, I mean, if I was to say where I got it from, you know, it's illegal and everything, it's silly to say that.
Don't you believe that this was a matter which you should have kept private?
But the thing is, you know, that I was asked a question by a newspaper. And the decision was whether to tell a lie or to tell him the truth, you know. I decided to tell him the truth. But I really didn't want to say anything, you know, because if I'd had my decision, you know, if I had it my way, I wouldn't have told anyone, you know, because I'm not trying to spread the word about this. But the man from the newspaper is the man from the mass medium, you know. I'll keep it a personal thing. If he does too, you know, if he keeps it quiet. But he wanted to spread it, so it's his responsibility, you know, for spreading it, not mine.
The thing is, Paul is always honest. If a reporter asked him, have you taken LSD, he's going to say yes. He wouldn't lie. Why should he? If they're going to ask that question, they get an honest answer. It was a risky thing for him to say, and I probably gave Brian Epstein a conniption. But basically, although the Beatles had made a lot of money, they were never really in it for the money. Once they had enough to really live well, that was it. I think that was a very good sign of them, that they paid their tax and they said what they wanted.
The Beatles' sense of security was about to be challenged, however. In late August, the band was shocked to receive the news that their manager, Brian Epstein, had died. Their most trusted accomplice. In his absence, they were suddenly left without his stabilizing influence. At the same time, their quest for personal and spiritual growth continued. George Harrison had become fascinated by Indian music in 1965, and as he immersed himself in its techniques, he became increasingly drawn to its spiritual foundations. This led him to discover the Indian guru Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and his technique of transcendental meditation. By mid-1967, Harrison was introducing his bandmates to the Maharishi's ideas, and soon the Beatles had a new spiritual advisor.
When they first got involved with him, I wrote and asked Allen Ginsberg what the story was on the Maharishi in India, because Ginsberg had lived there for a number of years, and he knew a lot of the gurus and the teachers and everything. And he wrote back saying that the Maharishi was very commercial and that he was under a lot of criticism in India for taking disciples' money, because in fact the teaching should be free. So I reported this to John Lennon, who came out with a wonderful line of, "Ain't no ethnic bastard gonna get any golden castles out of me."
Despite his initial reservations, in February 1968, Lennon and his bandmates traveled to India for an extended retreat with the guru. Joined by their various wives and girlfriends, their departure to the East for spiritual fulfillment made headlines worldwide. The press swarmed around the perimeter of the Maharishi's 14-acre compound, both intrigued and baffled by this latest chapter in the Beatles' unpredictable journey. This exposure brought Eastern religion to the attention of an enormous audience.
Sometime in January, it was suddenly like, right, we're off to Maharishi and we're living a holiday camp in India. You know, oh, right, have a good time, you know. But they did write a heck of a lot of songs while they were there, you know, churning them out.
The Beatles introduced the world, especially the young world, to things that they would never have stumbled upon had the Beatles not been there. The philosophy behind transcendental meditation, Buddhism, they were looking outwards. Meditation was at the center of it. That's actually really all that matters. It's the soul. The reality is here. Not many people had really thought about that before. And if the Beatles, the most popular band in the world, the most popular cultural phenomenon in the world, were talking earnestly about this stuff, obviously, as much as a lot of the elders might laugh, at least as many young people went along with them. And, you know, sales of texts of Eastern wisdom, they went through the roof in the late 60s. People flocked to see the Maharishi. The Beatles were this gateway to a kind of another world.
Although the band emerged from India both spiritually and creatively refreshed, this sense of calm would be short-lived. In February 1968, they set up their own corporation, Apple. This multifaceted company was developed to broaden the Beatles' activities and to retain full control over their output. Yet it would prove the first of many overambitious projects for the band. And as they entered the studio in the summer to work on their follow-up to Sgt. Pepper, for the first time, creative and personal disputes crept into the recording sessions. A particular source of tension was the daily presence of an outsider in the Beatles' inner sanctum, the conceptual artist Yoko Ono, with whom John Lennon had fallen deeply in love. It was a relationship that had been blossoming in private for more than a year. While McCartney had been growing in confidence through his underground activities, Lennon's sense of isolation in rural Surrey had increased. Initially finding a release through LSD, it was Yoko Ono who offered him a means of escape. A relatively unknown artist when she had travelled to London with husband Tony Cox in 1966, it was through the Indica Gallery that she came into contact with Lennon. Its owner, John Dunbar, provided the space for Ono's first UK exhibition, and it was he who invited his Beatle friend to attend this unusual show.
She was plainly a kind of interesting, powerful woman. I didn't show ordinary, pictures on the wall at all, really. And so, she had some good ideas, and I liked them. She wanted to do a show, so we managed to find a couple of weeks where we didn't have something on. Yoko was reluctant to have anybody look at it until she'd totally finished everything, and labelled everything and everything. And so we were sort of doing that. But me and Tony had to sort of tell her that, look, this guy might buy something, you never know. He came round and he did like the ladder, and then, I've been looking through the magnifying glass and it says yes, so he liked that.
The relationship that developed across the following 2 years would be consummated in May 1968, just before the Beatles began work on the White Album. Lennon emerged a changed man, released from an unhappy marriage and liberated as an artist.
The arrival of Yoko Ono into John's life transformed Lennon completely. She was the mother, lover, teacher. She was kind of everything, really, to John. He needed that.
When he met Yoko, she was basically a mother figure. I mean, he used to call her mother. She, for her own reasons, took him on and saved him, actually.
As Ono's presence made an impact on both Lennon and the bond between the Beatles, the world outside of the band began to darken. As the war in Vietnam spiraled further out of control, and with no apparent end to the conflict in sight, across the West, the cultural movement so inspired by the Beatles no longer believed love is all you need. The progressive, liberal core of the counterculture came under fire, with the assassinations of first civil rights leader Martin Luther King and then presidential candidate Robert Kennedy increasing tensions. Both in the US and Britain, once peaceful anti-war demonstrations descended into violence. Student riots brought Paris to a standstill, and images of street skirmishes and police brutality became commonplace. As the authorities led an unforgiving onslaught on the counterculture, revolution replaced love as the new objective.
In '68, it all exploded. You had assassinations in the States, the threat of civil war, riots at the Democratic Convention, riots in Paris, in London, violence on the streets. Actually, there was a sort of a fight. Power, you don't really get power. It won't trickle down. It has to be sort of forced. And if you look at history, that tends to be the case. The Beatles' revolution was a benign one through art and love. But by '68, the bricks were flying all over the place.
It wasn't just the kind of sweet utopianism of the Summer of Love, but really days of rage. The demonstrations at the Democratic Convention in Chicago in 1968, was a kind of dividing line. You saw the police out there like clubbing kids, and there really was a sense of, we're kind of at war now.
Just as this unrestrained police brutality tore through Chicago in August 1968, the Beatles issued the single Revolution, addressing the struggles of a youth culture under threat. Yet unlike All You Need Is Love the previous year, John Lennon's composition refused to express the voice of this disillusioned movement or to accept the call to arms of the radical left. For the first time, this saw the Beatles turned upon by their own peers. Yet Lennon's reluctance to commit to violence not only led to two different versions of the track, but also reflected the inner struggles that many young people were dealing with.
The song Revolution, there are two versions of it. Lennon goes back and forth on, don't you know that you can count me out in as far as revolution is concerned. You know, exactly where you were supposed to stand was difficult. All young people were feeling that. You know, go to a protest? Yeah, sure. Go to a protest that maybe occupies a building? Oh, maybe, you know, burning that building down? Do you draw the line there?
If you're talking about destruction, Lennon's saying, count me out, then he's saying, count me in. He doesn't know. He's on the fence. At that point, Lennon, as much as he could be a bit handy, was seduced by this idea of peace and love. He'd just written the anthem of the previous year.
There always was a kind of inherent optimism in the Beatles somehow, whereas that wasn't true of Dylan. It wasn't true of the Stones. It was almost like Martin Luther King. You know, people don't say this now, but there was a sense in which, you know, a lot of the black radicals who were emerging seemed more of the moment. Dr. King seemed like kind of part of the protest establishment. And in a certain way, the Beatles seemed a little bit like that too.
If the band were losing some of their relevance as a cultural force, through Yoko Ono's influence, John Lennon ensured that they remained musical pioneers. Where revolution had pulled its punches politically, an experimental collage that he created with his new partner captured the chaos of 1968 simply through sound itself. When it was issued on the band's self-titled LP at the close of the year, the track Revolution 9 became the most widely heard avant-garde composition ever released. It was a startling statement from a man who had been heralding in the summer of love only a year beforehand.
He went from one extreme to the other. Lennon suddenly saw it's all gone wrong. He turned to the flip side, and the flip side was Revolution number 9, Revolution 9, which was a very, very different view of the future.
Number 9, number 9, number 9, number 9, number 9.
Revolution 9 was the sound really of not just the riots in Paris and on the streets of Chicago. This is the sound of the apocalypse. This is his incredibly honest depiction of the worst fear of all, which is a society and a world in sort of global turmoil. It's an extraordinary piece and one of the scariest pieces of music that you could ever hear. In the 21st century, Revolution 9 is far more relevant than it ever was, I think, in '68.
Having delivered the most extreme composition in the Beatles' catalogue, Lennon's further experimental activities continued outside of the band. By the end of 1968, the first of a trilogy of albums with Yoko Ono was issued, Two Virgins, with a cover depicting the couple naked. Still a member of the most popular and commercially successful act in the world, Lennon was now breaking every rule imaginable. Yet the anger in some quarters of the counterculture toward the song Revolution also led him into a greater political role. And in 1969, As Richard Nixon was sworn in as the new president of America, John Lennon and Yoko Ono emerged as the world's most prominent activists.
When Lennon came out and he said, "If you're talking about destruction, count me out," he was terribly criticized by the hard left. And it seems to me that his reaction to that was not to change his mind about destruction, but actually to say, no, I really don't think the answer is destruction. I think the answer actually is peace.
In March 1969, John Lennon and Yoko Ono were married. With their honeymoon, the couple embarked on a high-profile campaign for peace, presented as a series of conceptual art events. In the spirit of the Beatles' initial attitude to the press, the first of these took place in their hotel bridal suite, in which they invited journalists to discuss politics openly and frankly.
This is for the world peace, you see, and we're thinking that instead of going out and fight and make war or something like that, we should just stay in bed. Everybody should just stay in bed and enjoy the spring, you know.
He put his career right on the line there for his beliefs, and you have to applaud him for that, of course. It brought him an awful lot of harassment and trouble.
While you're in bed and you're giving your press conferences in pillowcases, are you laughing at us?
No, no.
It's no more than you're laughing at us, you know. I mean, we have a laugh. We think it's funny that the front page news should be the fact that two people went to bed on their honeymoon. We see the funny side of it. And that in Vienna, which is a pretty square place, there's all these beautiful photographs of microphones being held to a bag, you know, to wait for the bag to speak.
It's rather nice, you know.
But we're serious about the peace bit, you know.
Brave, foolhardy, they were all of that. But who else would have done that then? It would be front page news if they're in bed talking about peace. John didn't know necessarily the ins and outs of the whole Vietnam thing. He and Yoko knew that it was wrong to be dropping napalm on villages and stripping the skin off children. I mean, he wasn't wrong in that thinking. He really wasn't wrong.
As the couple's honeymoon moved from Europe to Canada, they were joined in their hotel room by Timothy Leary, Allen Ginsberg, and a variety of counterculture figures to record an anthem for their campaign. And where their experimental records and their public appearances had left many confused, this song managed to bring their message to a global audience.
Give Peace a Chance was his attempt to do something in his own terms that was actually useful, and I think it proved to be so. He wrote an anthem. It's a simplistic anthem, but it's an anthem that has a good heart and a good message, and that people have been singing ever since.
He's moved further and further away from the elegant combination of artistic musical choices and resonant text into records that only have a message. He had that ability to distill something down to its bare essence, make it communicative, make it unforgettable, and it still resonates to this day.
While Lennon pressed on campaigning for peace, the close of the decade saw the first major casualties of the youth movement, with the death of Rolling Stone Brian Jones and permanent narcotics damage on both Beach Boy Brian Wilson and the Pink Floyd's Syd Barrett. The utopian vision of a brave new world was crumbling, and this was reflected within the Beatles camp itself. The tensions that had previously arisen in the studio now spread into the bandmates' own relationships with each other. And when McCartney married his new partner, Linda Eastman, in 1969, none of his fellow Beatles attended the ceremony. As the world moved into the 1970s, Paul issued his debut solo record along with a press release, which announced that he was quitting the band. It was official. The Beatles were no more. The demise of the band shocked their fans worldwide, yet those close to the musicians had watched them gradually drift apart over a 2-year period.
There was no cohesion. The old Liverpool bubble that they all used to live in and see each other all the time and love each other and be tolerant of each other's foibles and differences had gone. So now they were spinning off in different directions with new ideas, new families, new girlfriends, new children. It just wasn't working anymore. It was obvious, really, that the Beatles as a group had pretty much come to an end.
Has a multi-million-dollar entertainment act ever broken up because it wasn't fun anymore? Well, we know actually, because so many groups from that same period continued and continued and continued when it most definitely wasn't fun anymore. The Beatles ended it because the reasons that they had gotten into doing it ceased to have value for them. So they said, let's not do this anymore. That's as powerful a statement about their integrity and their intentions and their values as anything that I can think of.
In the Beatles' wake, youth culture became more divided. Rock music got heavier and more self-indulgent, and pop turned its attention to glamour. As for the band members themselves, despite Lennon's continued activism and string of hit singles, McCartney's mainstream triumph through his band Wings, and Harrison's successful emergence as an artist in his own right, their impact as individuals could never match that of their Beatles' glory days. Yet although their vision of utopia had failed to materialize, the world was still forever changed by the Beatles' innovations and the values that they represented. Even if no one has ever managed to compete with that impact, with every successive generation of musicians, the Beatles remain the benchmark for how popular entertainers can interact with the wider world.
Did the cultural and musical changes to which they were without any doubt the largest contributors have a permanent effect on how rock and roll conceived itself? Yeah, permanent effect on how rock and roll conceived itself. So that there's, even now, in this kind of glitzy pop era, pop stars see it as an option that they have to accept or refuse to be conscious, controversial, and some choose one and others really deny it, and some are extremely bland. But it's there on the table, always there on the table for everybody.
And as the band's astonishing achievements continue to make an impact half a century later, the legacy of the Beatles and of the remarkable decade in which they flourished remains unrivaled. The unique story of 4 working-class Liverpudlians who changed the world.
Lennon said something along the lines of, we weren't leaders in this world. We were just the guys on the mast saying, land ahoy. We were letting you know what we could see. And without the Beatles, understanding the 60s would have been a completely different experience.
They touched everything. The Beatles covered it all. If you want to know what the 60s are about, you listen to Beatles records. It tells you, the story is there.
This sounds like a cliche, but it's really impossible to overstate the Beatles' impact. It sounds like you're exaggerating, and to younger people who weren't there, you know, it just sounds ridiculous. You know, but it was true. You know, they changed everything.
By the mid-1970s, the Stones were in trouble. Having lost their inspiration, their relevance, and their lead guitarist, they bravely changed their sound and recruited Ronnie Wood, who galvanized the band.
Ronnie is sort of like a glue that holds this band together. He came there with an energy that they needed that nobody else provided. his personality, imbues the Stones with a vitality that they had been missing for a long time, even though the rest of the world may not know it. Mick and Keith know it.
As the decade progressed, the band adapted to new trends, incorporating funk, disco and punk into their sound. And as guitarist Keith Richards was deteriorating, it was up to Mick Jagger to lead the Stones into uncharted territory.
The period from 76 through to the mid-80s, Jagger is really at the helm. Keith was out there, crashed out under the sofa quite a lot of the time, and he really had his work cut out. When the Stones had their backs against the wall, there's that element of sort of fight there.
But by the dawn of the 1980s, the creative partnership that had made the Stones so influential was mutating, and a feud between Jagger and Richards threatened to tear the band apart.
You've got to have one guy who's extrovert and ambitious and together and controlling and all those things. And then the flip side of that, or the yang to that yin, or however you want to put it, is the more saturnine, darker figure, the creative animus of the thing. But I think at a certain point, those poles become more starkly defined. You know, in other words, you know, Mick becomes more controlling and more ambitious, and Keith becomes more sort of set in his ways.
This programme looks at the Stones' output from 1975 to 1983, a troubled time in which, despite the internal conflicts and the continued struggle to remain relevant, the band still managed to produce enduring work.
If you listen to these records today, yes, they are patchy, but there are the last moments of Rolling Stones' majesty and greatness in these records.
In the late 1960s and early 70s, the Rolling Stones were at the height of their powers. Where the death of their founding member Brian Jones in 1969 may have broken a lesser band, the Stones instead discovered a greater drive and focus in his absence, and with a string of remarkable albums ascended to the very top of popular music. With the Beatles gone, Dylan treading water, and American figureheads Jimi Hendrix and Jim Morrison succumbing to the same excesses that had taken Jones, by 1972's Exile on Main Street, the Stones were left seemingly unchallenged as the world's greatest rock and roll band. Yet over the next 2 years, their fortunes changed, and the albums Goat's Head Soup and It's Only Rock and Roll were met with a more muted response from fans and critics, while a new wave of young musicians, spearheaded by David Bowie, began to make their presence felt in the UK, the Stones seemed to be losing their grip.
Right around the time of Goat's Head Soup and It's Only Rock and Roll, you really began to wonder about, what was the meaning of the Rolling Stones at this point. Now, that was happening with rock and roll in general, by the way. There was I've interviewed Bruce Springsteen about this, and it was around the time he was coming out. And as he said, he goes, at the time that people were referring to me as the new Dylan, the old Dylan was 33. Just being past 30 raised questions about your relevance as a rock star and your ability to be part of this rock and roll world. And everybody was feeling that.
If I could stick my pen in my heart, spread it all over the stage, would it be enough for your cheap heart? Would you make the boys insane? It's strange.
With the Rolling Stones, they had just come off, a run of records that, is as strong as anything anyone has ever done in rock and roll. But everybody was trying to find their way in the 70s, and Goat's Head Soup and It's Only Rock and Roll are records, I think, that suggest, the Rolling Stones responding to things rather than driving them. There are good songs on both Goat's Head Soup and It's Only Rock and Roll, but, you can't really make a strong argument for them as, major Stones statements.
It's only rock and roll, but
It's Only Rock and Roll did not produce a top 10 single in America, which was the first time that had happened since Their Satanic Majesty's request. Well, that you can understand because the Stones just did not cope with 1967. They were not a peace and love group. But in 1974, you would have thought they should have been able to come up with something, but nothing off of that album was a hit. and it actually looked like they were winding down.
Internally, the band were also struggling. With Mick Jagger and his wife Bianca stepping out into high society, the frontman's dedication to music seemed to be waning, and Keith Richards' worsening heroin addiction was leading to a very visible deterioration. By the end of 1974, just before the Stones intended to return to the studio to begin work on a new album, Brian Jones' replacement Mick Taylor announced that he was leaving the group. Although many felt he had never seemed comfortable as part of the ensemble, the departure came as a shock to his other bandmates.
When Mick Taylor announced his departure, Jagger said he was very, very disappointed by it. I think it really shocked the band. Within a few weeks, Jagger was saying, actually, Keith Richards is the sound of the Stones. Mick Taylor wasn't really a Stone at all. But, and in a way, at the time, we undervalued him, I think. But listening back, he contributed so much, and he saw the Stones through that period with his very elegant, virtuoso playing, which I think was crucial at that time when everyone was looking towards, progressive rock and rock being almost on a classical status. Mick Taylor contributed so much, from the guitar meshing from Honky Tonk Women, Sticky Fingers. I think he vaguely co-wrote Sway. He's All Over Exile, Ventilator Blues, he got a co-credit. And then even It's Only Rock and Roll, when you felt that he was being nudged out a little bit, he does this wonderful Carlos Santana-style guitar solo on Time Waits for No One. So his contributions, I think, were immense in that way, and we almost didn't realise until he'd gone, what he'd weaved into the fabric of the Stones.
Despite the setback, the band pressed on and immediately began looking for another guitarist. One figure in particular stood out as a potential new recruit. Ron Wood, formerly of the Jeff Beck Group and then a member of the Faces, had become close friends with Keith Richards. In early '74, he had both contributed to the title track of It's Only Rock and Roll and enlisted Richards, Jagger and Mick Taylor to contribute to his own solo LP, I've Got My Own Album to Do. As the Stones went into the studio in December to begin sessions for Black and Blue, Wood seemed the natural choice to join them.
Just as the Faces were a kind of version of the Stones, a sort of more laddish and less sort of decadent, more boozy, laddish version of the Stones, so Ronnie was Keith to Rod Stewart's Mick Jagger. I mean, that's very clear that they were sort of Xerox of the Stones in many ways. And so people knew Ronnie in that way, that he was like this kind of, he was like one of the crows out of the Jungle Book with a kind of fag sticking out of his mouth and, the sort of Rugrats hair. And, so Ronnie was a bit of a cartoon, I think, more than anything else. You didn't revere him as a riffmaster or rhythm guitarist in the way that Keith was.
The main appeal about Ronnie Wood was that he felt instinctively as if he was a Rolling Stone even before he was in the Faces, I think. I remember his brother Art Wood, I interviewed him once, and he said Ronnie always felt that was his destiny. And also he was Keith Richards' playmate, which was the polar opposite of what Mick Taylor was. They were very, very different, both in the way they played and in their social lives as well. Ronnie and Keith, mid-'73, I think, they were living together, or, Keith lived at the bottom of the Wick. Ronnie was a little bit at a loose end in the Faces because Rod had this solo career that was going along at the same time, so no one in the Faces quite knew what they were, what their status was, really. And Ronnie came up with his solo album in '74, which Keith and Mick both contributed. Keith actually contributed 2 great songs, Act Together and Sure the One You Need, to that, and Keith actually played at the gig. So Ronnie did have a profile, certainly a higher profile than some of the other guitarists that were mentioned, There was even talk of Alexis Korner, Harvey Mandel, Wayne Perkins, Jorma Kaukonen from Jefferson Airplane. I mean, that would have been incredible, but very, very unlikely. Ronnie was the second guitarist in waiting. He really felt that even when he was in the Faces.
Throughout the early months of 1975, the Stones invited 3 of the guitarists on the shortlist to the sessions for Black and Blue. Along with Wood, the American guitarists Wayne Perkins and Harvey Mandel also recorded contributions. Yet with the first official compilation of their Atlantic Records contract, Made in the Shade, ready for release, the band put the new album on hold and planned a major American tour with Ronnie Wood brought on board as the live guitarist. Despite seeing their crown slip with the previous 2 albums, when the band announced this new tour by performing on a truck down Fifth Avenue in New York, the reception proved that the Stones had lost none of their appeal.
You know, you can look at the records that they put out in the 70s, but at least in the States, there's something else that you have to bear in mind. Every 3 years, between 72 and 81, the Stones toured, and every time they toured, it was a very big deal. The biggest deal in rock and roll. Bigger than Rolling Thunder, bigger than Led Zeppelin, bigger than anything. The Stones were not diminished at that time, as I ever understood it. That happened in the 80s, not in the 70s. They were a real presence in American rock. They were the world's greatest rock and roll band.
Even if they were the world's greatest rock and roll band, the times were changing, and the Stones were ready to incorporate new elements into their sound. In 1975, funk was emerging, with George Clinton's Parliament and Funkadelic bands, Kool and the Gang and Sly and the Family Stone all achieving mainstream chart success. As ever, it was Jagger who had his antenna out for new musical trends. For the live shows, he invited Billy Preston, who had joined them on their 1973 tour, to participate in their performances in a far more prominent capacity, while bringing on board ex-Stevie Wonder percussionist Ollie Brown to add to the rhythms and make them more fresh.
Jagger, particularly, I think, was always on the lookout for what's happening contemporary-wise. You know, Keith might have his heart back in Robert Johnson days or Chess, but Mick is there listening to what's going on now and what will be going on next year. So I think he was always very aware of trends. Funk, I mean, well, he took his dancing from James Brown, the godfather of it, but they were always aware of Stevie Wonder. They did, I don't know why, they covered that Stevie Wonder song. Billy Preston was with them from 72, Goat's Head Soup, and you can hear on 100 Years Ago the funk element creeping in there. So by 75, it made sense. It brought a new kind of energy to the live performance as well, I think, just so it wasn't just a rock sound. And they were playing America, that tour was America, where funk was bigger.
Standing all alone. Well, I don't really know, but you better lay low.
And Jagger, again, his keen eye for David Bowie and what Bowie... There was this amazing rivalry that people forget, I think. Bowie changing course on every album, changing his musical course, changing his image course. I think Jagger looked at that and thought, that's what I should have been doing.
She spies the slinking vagabond, and curses as she passes a Ford Mustang. Heaven knows she take anything, but the beacon is tied up for nothing. Singing nothing, he cuts his hand, showing nothing, it goes like a song she cries. Where have all my heroes gone? All night to once a young American.
Bowie was starting to embrace his plastic soul, and Jagger didn't want to be left behind with that. So it did make sense to bring Ollie Brown and Billy on board.
That sense of having Billy Preston on stage, you know, a guy whose roots go back to gospel, go back to Little Richard, go back to all of that core stuff that the Stones always wanted to emulate. Well, Billy Preston lived it, you know, when as a teenager. You know, the guy's a first-rate player, a great songwriter, a fantastic singer, a showman, you know, and I think, you know, Mick kind of latched on to him. Got a couple of solo numbers, and you know that's not very typical. The Rolling Stones are not particularly generous that way, but I think Billy Preston got that partly because of who he was and, you know, just how good he is, but also partly because he served a certain function within the Stones' emotional dynamic. You know, I think the 1975 tour for the Rolling Stones was not a high point. And I think having Billy Preston along just kind of kept everybody's spirits up, you know, beyond what he added musically.
Yet for many, these additional musicians were simply window dressing, a smokescreen to deflect from the Stones' own lackluster performances. And despite record attendances, for the first time in the band's career, the press widely criticized the shows.
I think you could feel Jagger being a little bored with the Rolling Stones live, and there was an element of kind of self-parody, really. In particularly with Jagger. And the band, I think, was a little monochromatic. So it was discouraging because obviously you wanted them to be great, and they had always been great. You know, that famous announcement, you know, the greatest rock and roll band in the world, that was about live performance. That wasn't, you know, they made the greatest records, they're the greatest songwriters. You know, anybody can, you know, make that argument, but the greatest rock and roll band in the world, that was about the Stones on stage, and the Stones on stage were getting to be a little tired during this period.
The one thing the tour did manage to achieve was to put an end to the Stones' search for a guitarist. Having road-tested Ronnie, the band felt that they need look no further for Mick Taylor's replacement. When Rod Stewart announced that he was breaking up the Faces to fully embark on a solo career in December 1975, the group formally offered Wood a permanent position as a Rolling Stone.
I mean, when Ronnie walked in the room, just played by numbers, hey. That's it, it's obvious. Everybody else that was up for the gig agreed, you gotta, you know, so it was, there we are, lumbered with him, still are.
I think it was a perfectly good decision for them to make. I don't, you know, Harvey Mandel, what would that have meant? Nothing. Wood means something. Woody means something. He commits them to that kind of scruffy thing they started out with. And given who the rest of the guys are, especially Jagger, I think that's a good thing.
Were you a bit overawed when you joined the Stones? Well, there's no reason you should be overawed. Was it difficult to join?
Yeah, I was overawed because I always wanted to be in that band from college, and I said, well, I'm going to be in that band.
Really?
Yeah. And I just happened to make myself in the right place at the right time.
Is the experience of a big band like the Stones, is that very different from, say, the Faces, or was it just another shift of gear up?
Well, the Stones are a very much more well-organised working unit. You know, it's a fantastically well-organised unit, whereas the Faces was a very Oddbins sponsored, you know, very very party.
Yeah.
I think Ronnie was a safe choice for the Stones, really. Ronnie was a party animal. Ronnie was a good time chap who was going to just look right on stage in some way. I mean, I still think it was a really disappointing choice, you know, and I think it just said everything about the Stones' kind of laziness, that they just thought, oh, well, you know, Ronnie, we'll just have Ronnie in, you know. Whereas obviously Mick Taylor had provided such an interesting counterpoint, such a melodic counterpoint to Keith. Ronnie just didn't, to this day, I couldn't tell you what Ronnie is really doing in the Stones. You know, even when I know that he's the primary guitarist on a track, he just seems to me an utterly kind of indistinguishable guitarist with no real style of his own at all.
The choice of Ron Wood in the band was kind of Keith asserting himself and making that decision. Now, Mick Jagger always got along with Ron Wood, and I think finally, certainly went along with it. And, and I think ultimately, Ron Wood found ways to really be an interesting guitarist in the Rolling Stones. But I feel like, it was like Keith's buddy, getting into the band. Obviously, he's like Keith's little brother, emulates Keith, looks like Keith, acts like Keith, to a degree plays like Keith. And, I think Keith needed that. I don't think Mick Taylor, as fantastic as his playing was, ever really fully settled into the Rolling Stones. I mean, there was too much turmoil, and I don't think he ever figured out a way to sort that out. Whereas, Ron Wood was just kind of an easygoing guy. I mean, along with everything else, you kind of had to be. If you didn't have the right personality, that was as important as your playing.
Wood's musical contribution to the Stones could finally be heard on record in April '76, when the album Black and Blue was released. Continuing the band's run of US #1 LPs and hitting #2 in the UK, it demonstrated the Stones had lost little of their commercial appeal. Yet outside of the top 10 ballad Fool to Cry, the album was light on anthems or potential hits, and saw the band experimenting with both musical forms and 3 guitarists. Critical and public reaction was polarized.
Black and Blue is an interesting record. I think it was Ron Wood who said, it's very characteristic of Mick that he would manage, in his kind of canny way, to make the process of recruiting guitarists also be the recording of an album. And, so you get Harvey Mandel, and you get, Wayne Perkins, and you get Ron Wood, and you get Black and Blue also.
It is a work in progress album, really. But the work in progress is not the album, it's the group. But give me the choice of listening to Black and Blue and It's Only Rock and Roll, and 8 times out of 10, I'll take Black and Blue. I had a sense with It's Only Rock and Roll of decline. At least with Black and Blue, I had a sense of either marking time or in a couple of tracks, oh, these are okay.
When I come home, baby, and I've been working all night long, put my daughter on my knee, and she said, Daddy, what's wrong? She whispered in my ear so sweet. You know what she said? She said, Daddy, you're a fool to cry. You're a fool to cry. And it makes me wonder why.
It definitely seemed that Fool to Cry had effort behind it. And that becomes an important concept because with many albums after Exile on Main Street, one doubts Mick Jagger's fundamental commitment to songwriting.
Daddy, you're a fool to cry. You're a fool to cry. And it makes me wonder why.
Fool to Cry is one of those Rolling Stones Marmite tracks that you love it or you hate it. For me, it's a great haunting ballad and terrific vocal performance by Jagger. The idea that Jagger was going through the motions at this stage, I think is quite misguided. I mean, there are lots of other things going on in his life as well, and arguably his band is no longer the most important thing in his life, but it's still incredibly important to him. And, he I think he was aghast at the idea that the Stones could put out a deliberately substandard record. So this suggestion that he somehow wasn't trying or was operating on autopilot, I don't buy at all. And on a song like Fool to Cry, it's really quite an affecting song, and he sounds vulnerable, and he sounds to me like someone who cares and cares a lot.
That Jagger and the band cared was most evident on the album's notable opening track, Hot Stuff. If the presence of Billy Preston and Ollie Brown on the 1975 tour had suggested the influence of funk on the Stones' music, with this song they boldly broke from the formula and leapt into this flourishing genre.
On Black and Blue, if you take the track Hot Stuff, Harvey Mandel playing guitar on that, kind of a funk riff, Jagger doing his reggae thing at the end. And there's, the beginning of this kind of New York obsession that's starting to work with the Rolling Stones, oh, you people in New York City, I know you're all going broke, but I know you're tough, I found that a kind of compelling track. I mean, I liked it.
I think Hot Stuff was a remarkable track. As soon as the needle went down, you're like, my God, what's this? What have the Stones done? They'd really broken from type, especially after the disappointing previous album. So, and I think it worked amazingly well. You had the Harvey Mandel, who was playing the Isley Brothers style guitar, fluid lead guitar over Bill's bubbling, wonderful bass line. And I think it was almost like the rock band's version of Superstition or something, that energy that it had. So it was I think it set the tone for Black and Blue as well. That was a real positive step.
I really like that record, and I really like that record because at the time I thought, this is a good idea. I'm really glad they're doing this. This took some guts. I don't think disco sucks, and although this clearly was not a disco record, it was a rhythm record. This is not a songwriting record. There are not great songs on this record. But there is something else really rather courageous going on. Now, I know Mick now dismisses all this, and maybe it was a last resort for him. I don't know. But formally, they took a chance, especially Hey Negrita and Melody, which is mostly Billy Preston playing both piano and organ. And rhythmically, these are very, very strong, interesting tracks. Finally, Charlie Watts is the ideal rock drummer. He's not a funk drummer. So he isn't really, and Bill is hanging in there. That's all. He's not Bootsy Collins either. So that it has a certain there's a kind of drag to the groove. There is still very much some 4/4 feeling and spirit in it, even if they're trying to not quite do that. But doesn't matter. Everything else is just clicking. The rhythms are really, really interesting. And you can just listen to them interplay on both those tracks. I found them inexhaustible.
Here's one last dollar, and then we go. One last dollar, she said, and
I thought Black and Blue at the time, and still now, as a great Stones record. In fact, probably their best 70s record after Exile and Sticky Fingers. John Peel, actually, at the time, played it in its entirety, and he said this is quite probably the best Stones album ever, which people forget. It was dealt harshly by the critics, I think, at the time. When the Stones had their backs against the wall, you know, they didn't have a guitarist, it was just four of them, there's that element of sort of fight there. And I think time has borne out that it actually is a pretty successful record.
Black and Blue was not without controversy, however. A Billboard poster advertising the album in Los Angeles inflamed certain groups. Featuring a bound and bruised woman under the quote, "I'm black and blue from the Rolling Stones, and I love it," the ad secured the band valuable publicity. Yet in a decade when attitudes and sensibilities were changing, it also made the Rolling Stones seem outdated.
The infamous ads for Black and Blue, you know, the woman, whatever her name was, on the Sunset Strip billboard, you know, and I liked it or whatever. I mean, for me, it's less about sort of shock tactics and outraging the feminist movement. It really does show how out of touch they were. You know, how much they were part of the problem, really. I mean, there was a certain level of English rock musician that just sort of epitomised some kind of misogyny, sexism, just so sort of unenlightened, so out of touch with any idea that women could be equals. I mean, that's the world they lived in. They just lived in a world where a woman was, you know, was either a kind of slut or a groupie or a 6'2" Texan model on your arm, or just you know, arm candy. Just no real kind of idea that women deserved respect. And that billboard, just to me, is so egregious. It goes way beyond. I mean, it's just absolutely inexcusable.
And the band's continued struggle to keep up with the times was brought into sharp focus when they returned to the UK to promote the album in May. Where their use of funk rhythms may have seemed current to American audiences, in England a musical revolution was in progress, and a new scene was emerging that was actively disassociating itself from the bloated excesses of millionaire rock stars. Punk was looking to rebuild popular music, and it wanted nothing to do with the Stones. The stage props that had worked to entertain the masses on their US tour in 1975, including a giant inflatable penis and Jagger swinging on a trapeze above the audience, would be viewed back in their homeland as laughable examples of how ridiculous this once vital act had become.
How did someone as smart as Mick Jagger say, "Oh yeah, sure, that's a great idea. We'll have a big blow-up penis on stage"? You know, it just is something that so easily lends itself to parody and is so unnecessary. You know, it was part of what was happening in rock and roll is, you know, the halls got bigger and bigger, and the audiences, you know, got kind of less and less connected to the band. You know, by the time you're in arenas and certainly in stadiums, you know, it's not necessarily only your truest, deepest, you know, most ardent fans who are there. It's kind of everybody who's looking for something to do on Thursday night is there. And you have to, and you know, I think you could feel like you have to entertain them, not just with your music, and that's where the inflatable penis comes in, and it's a big problem.
I remember being in Earl's Court for the giant inflatable penis, and I just thought, I mean, it was just one of those things where you did want to hide your head in your hands, and it shot out confetti and the whole thing. I mean, nothing left to the imagination here. And you thought, why? For those people who were not loyal to the Stones to begin with, this was alienating. So they were not the role models anymore. It's quite amazing how punk comes along, and even though you would have thought these guys are rebels, the Stones in the late 60s were rebels, there's got to be some affinity here, there was no reference. There was no backwards reference.
I saw them in '76, and I went with my sister. As we were going to Earl's Court, We bumped into some punks, and it was the very, very early days of punks. They've been in the press for a couple of months or so. Years later, I interviewed Captain Sensible, and I also did a book on Sid Vicious, and I found out that they were at Earl's Court. Captain remembers it, and when I did the Vicious stuff, and Vicious was there as well. They'd gone to laugh at the old hippies who were going to see the Stones. Having, you know, Jagger swinging from a rope, I think at one point he said, "Oh, it's the best part of the show, that is, swinging on this rope," you know, and then he on this giant penis, and the lotus-shaped stage, and which he designed with Peter Rudge. I mean, Jagger saw himself as an art director. You know, by this time he was the head of a corporation and films, and you know, it wanted more than just rock. Rock wasn't really enough for him, but for a disaffected young generation who'd come through and seen the wild Bolan and Bowie, they wanted something different from their rock stars, I think, and the Stones just didn't speak to that generation at all.
As punk grew into a major musical and cultural phenomenon, in the UK, the only Stone to escape with his reputation intact was Keith Richards. Where the stage props and the superficiality were seen to stem from Jagger, Richards remained a more credible figure, less interested in celebrity posturing and sticking to his ragged blues roots. Yet he was also an icon for the wrong reasons. By 1976, the guitarist once crowned the world's most elegantly wasted man was in reality an addict, ailing both physically and mentally.
It's very interesting, you know, the emergence of Keith Richards, which I always trace to the 1969 Rolling Stones tour, you know, where Keith had, you know, the kind of haystack hairdo, you know, he became Keith, you know, and he emerged out of Jagger's shadow and really became a kind of second frontman in the band. Suddenly there were long interviews with Keith Richards and, you know, in Rolling Stone and in other magazines, and he became a counter-focus, you know, alongside Mick Jagger. And part of that was, you know, Keith as outlaw, Keith scoffing at drug laws and all this other kind of stuff. And it was fun, and it was exciting, and of course Keith is great and a great player, but then it really became, wait a second, this guy's a junkie and really is in trouble here. Like, it's not just a photograph anymore.
You can only be elegantly wasted for so long before hard drugs robs you of your soul and your creativity and your muse. It will destroy you in the end, you know. Hard drugs becomes a be-all and end-all in itself. It's just you are using in order to use. You're not using in order to sort of fuel the fire of creativity anymore. You're just using in order to somehow stay functioning and normal. And so, you know, by 76, Keith is like a ghost, really, creatively.
Yet in 1977, these problems would spiral out of control. Having already been charged with possession of cocaine in the UK, and having lost his infant son, Tara, to respiratory failure at the end of the previous year, in February, Richards made world headlines. Arrested in Toronto with large quantities of cocaine and heroin, his passport was detained by the Canadian court, and his movements restricted over the following 8 months. With the very real threat that such a key component in their band may be jailed for years, the Stones were apparently stranded.
They had to wake me up to formally arrest me. And that took them about 2 hours to drag me out. Bang, bang. So it was like rosy cheeks, and he's awake. You are under arrest. Oh, great. You know, I looked at the old lady and said, I've seen about 7 years, babe.
The implications of the Toronto bust were just enormous. First off, it threw into question the whole future of the band. I mean, the initial charges were not for possession, they were for trafficking, which, as I understand it at the time, carried a mandatory prison sentence in Canada. So the likelihood was that he was going to go down. Even if the charges were reduced to possession, would they be able to tour America, which was obviously the most lucrative market? So it's huge. The whole future of the band is in question. But also, you know, the questions it raises about Keith's state, and was he actually in any fit condition to continue in the band? As it happens, he gets partially cleaned up because of the bust, and in a paradoxical kind of way, the bust that threatens the disintegration of the Stones may actually be the thing that enabled them to keep going. Apart from anything else, I think it was really the bust and the events in the wake of the bust that led to him and Anita Pallenberg breaking up. And I think it's highly probable that if Keith and Anita had stayed together, neither of them would still be alive. Happily, they both pulled through separately. Together, it might have been a very different story.
With Keith unavailable during the majority of '77, the Stones were inactive, save for the release of their third live album, Love You Live, in September. Yet 3 months later, the band were able to begin sessions for a new album. And after years of recording in the UK and the US, work on this new material took place in EMI's Pathé Marconi studios in Paris. Unlike their previous albums, the band called in few guest musicians to add to their sound. One exception was a young, relatively unknown harmonica player named Sugar Blue.
I had been playing at a club called Le Vieil Gris and doing a lot of busking in the metros and on the streets of Paris. There was a friend of theirs that I believe was working with Cubby Broccoli on a new Bond movie at the time. And he came to a party where I was playing at, here it is jamming. And he gave me a mixed number and said, call. Okay, so I thought that friends of mine were pulling my leg, right? What have I got to lose? So I called the number, and I know Jagger's voice. I mean, you know, from interviews and things like that. And I hear this really heavy Cockney accent on the other side, and I'm going, okay, somebody's pulling my leg. This is a joke, and what the heck, you know? So I just go along with it. He says, well, why don't you show up at a studio Bois de Boulogne in the Bois de Boulogne right outside of Paris. And I go, well, okay, what the heck, you know? I figure, you know, I'm the butt end of a joke, but it's okay, I'll go for it. And I get out there, and lo and behold, it was Jagger, and he puts on this accent to sort of try and be under the radar, you know. He doesn't want a lot of people to recognize him. Keith says, choose an amp, any amp. There were like 50 of them. You know? And he says, that one over there, that one's mine. I said, okay, maybe that's got the right mojo. I'll try that one. And I did, actually, and it sounded great. And we started playing. I mean, you know, we jumped right into it. It was, we started playing, and I think we stopped playing about a good 2 or 3 hours later. You know, it was like, it was 1, 2, 3, hit it, play, jam, have fun, you know. Been playing constantly for maybe, and I mean like constantly, for like 12, 18 hours a day for a year or more. I had been practicing like a man possessed. And I had just come to Europe and landed in France, and I had something to prove. And it was very important to me that the power and the dedication and the belief in the music that I was playing should come through every note, every time I hit. And I think that I was so impassioned in my delivery, I think that maybe they heard that, you know, because I wanted to play in the tradition, but I wanted to add to the tradition, you know, like Willie Dixon used to say, the most important thing that you can do as a blues man is to add to the canon of the blues. And I was working very, very hard on that. And I think that they heard my passion.
As the Paris sessions spread into 1978, despite the strain of Richard's continued court proceedings, the Stones were going through a purple patch. With Jagger at the helm, penning a wealth of new material, The band recorded enough tracks to fill 2 or 3 albums, and after years of struggle had seemingly rediscovered their passion and creative energy in the studio.
I think Woody had a lot to do with bringing them back to that raw and vital feel, you know, because Woody is very incendiary. I mean, he has a kind of personality that just glows, and everything around him catches fire. There is something vital in his personality that is, and about the way he plays, that goes beyond technique, if you would. There is that which makes Ronnie Ronnie, his personality, imbues the Stones with a vitality that they had been missing for a long time. I mean, of course, the Glimmer Twins, Nick and Keith, but you know, they've been together, they know each other. It's like an old marriage, you know. And it was kind of like, you know, one of the guests at the wedding 30 years ago came and reminded them how much they loved each other, you know, and that brought the music and the magic together.
If Wood was key in revitalizing the band in the studio, it was Jagger who provided the album's creative drive. Like John Lennon before him, he had made New York his home base in 1976 and had been soaking up the city's extremes of squalor and decadence and its many flourishing artistic movements. New music in particular was thriving, emanating from the seismic influence of Andy Warhol in the mid to late 60s. In the Lower East Side, the city had developed its own punk movement, which both predated and inspired its British counterpart. Whereas further north in Manhattan, Studio 54 had opened its doors in '77 to a heady mix of disco, celebrity, and cocaine. The album Some Girls may have been recorded in Europe, but at its heart were the distinctive sounds and stories of New York City, all filtered through the mind of Mick Jagger.
In the mid-'70s, New York essentially was going bankrupt. And the city seemed out of control. You know, suddenly the whole graffiti thing was happening. So every time a train rolled into the station, it was just covered in graffiti. And there just seemed to be a sense of, you know, this town is turning into, you know, kind of jungle in a way. You know, there was a sense of the streets being very raw. You know, every single union in the city went on strike for months for one reason or another. And, you know, finally there was, you know, the economic problems that the city was having. You know, there was a famous New York Daily News cover about President Gerald Ford saying, you know, Ford to city, drop dead. You know, it's just like, we're not going to rescue New York. And there was a sense of New York, you know, in its own way, kind of teetering on the brink of real collapse. As often happens, I mean, as New York was in that kind of danger, it kind of was going through a strange artistic flourishing. I mean, punk rock was happening, disco was happening, you know, the early stirrings of hip-hop were happening. The energy of the city is coming from its kind of artistic community, and all of that is reflected in Some Girls, you know, walking Central Park, creeping after dark. People think I'm crazy, you know, that sense of, you know, the danger of what New York is. And that's, you know, the great sort of thing about Jagger. I mean, as much as people say, you know, well, he's a socialite, you know, he's removed. When the Stones announced their 1975 tour, you know, they did it on a flatbed truck that went up Fifth Avenue. It got, again, a lot of attention to New York City. And if you look at Mick Jagger's outfit, he's wearing these jeans and his left pant leg is rolled up. That's a bike messenger fashion, you know, so that your pant leg didn't get caught in the chain of your bike. And, you know, people were picking up on that, like, on the street, and there's Mick Jagger, like, picking up on it. It was not, you know, it wasn't something that people were doing at Studio 54, but it was just such a cool kind of gesture. That's the kind of New York, I think, that Jagger presents. I think Some Girls, in many ways, is primarily Mick Jagger's record. And that's the vision of New York. You know, on the one hand, you know, am I hard enough? Am I tough enough? Am I rich enough? You know, in Beast of Burden. And at the same time, you know, the guy who's distraught and walking through Central Park in the middle of the night in Miss You, you know, you're getting both sides of
of what New York City is, because Jagger, I think, felt comfortable moving in both those worlds.
Do you ever go and see other bands?
Oh, yeah.
Like who? Who do you like?
Well, I mean, mostly when I'm in New York, I go around sort of clubbing, you know, a lot of nights of the week, Thursdays and Fridays. But, I mean, I just see every new band there is. I mean, lists and lists and lists. Some of them are not very good, some of them are.
Released in June 1978, Some Girls provided the shot in the arm that the Stones' career so desperately needed. Hailed by the music press as the band's strongest work since Exile on Main Street, it became their biggest-selling studio album to date. After years of criticism for his lifestyle and questions over his commitment to music, Mick Jagger and his New York Odyssey have made the Stones relevant again.
I see New York on the cover of Some Girls to start with. There's a sort of Warholian iconoclasm, taking some of those faces of celebrities and then doing something, you know, rather punkish with them. So straight away, that felt much more New York than London. There's this image, stereotypical image of Mick who loves expensive cuisine, expensive girls. But I remember a quote from Ian Stewart, who basically said that Mick just organises everything. You know, Keith was out there, crashed out under the sofa quite a lot of the time. Mick really held it together, and he particularly held it together through Some Girls. This was a vital period when, you know, Keith had had his bust as well, and he really had his work cut out. I mean, to the point of getting Ronnie to teach him bits on the guitar as well. I mean, it was real hands-on kind of stuff. So I think that Jagger does have to take enormous credit for that throughout the band's whole career, actually, but particularly this period where they were potentially quite vulnerable.
And with Jagger at the helm, the first single from the album displayed a brazen disregard for the band's vulnerability and plunged them headfirst into disco. An underground musical phenomenon that had been seeping into the mainstream since the mid-70s, Jagger had been sampling the scene firsthand at Studio 54, where his wife Bianca had become the unofficial queen of the club. Although it had been dismissed out of hand as a musical fad by certain parts of the rock community, in 1977 the film Saturday Night Fever had become a nationwide sensation. A major part of its appeal were the hit songs contributed to the soundtrack by the Bee Gees, which marked the first successful fusion of disco and rock, and the Rolling Stones released Miss You, hot on the heels of these developments. The single became their first US #1 since 1973's Angie.
I remember when the bass line went disco, I was like, that's different, especially for the Stones. I'm like, they're gonna play disco? Okay, that'll work. And when we hit the groove, I understood that they were trying to incorporate the tradition with a new tradition, introducing blues harmonica into a disco groove. And hey, I think it was a great idea, you know, because I mean, I've always been a fan of disco, and I'm definitely a blues man. Well, hey, it's evident, you know, in hindsight, that it was genius, you know, because it became the hit of '78. I mean, you know, you couldn't go anywhere and not hear that song.
Miss You is, thank heaven for them, an excellent fusion of rock and disco. Disco was the first time since the twist when every leading artist felt compelled or was compelled to record a song in that style. And so just as you had Frank Sinatra sing Everybody's Twistin', which was ridiculous, of course, he survived. People moved on and went back to their regular lines of work. But everybody hit the reefs on disco. Elton John put out a disco 12-inch, flop. Aretha Franklin disco record, nobody needed it. But the Stones put out Miss You. Part of the reason they got away with it is because Mick was always into the R&B rhythms and dance steps. And In that song, Miss You, he very cleverly used falsetto that Barry Gibb had popularized. Jagger learned, I'm sure, from the Bee Gees. It's incredible to think of Mick Jagger learning from the Bee Gees, but he saw how popular those records were. And Miss You, he's great with his falsetto. Jagger with Miss You has two things which are from the first period of disco, one of which is song structure. Miss You is a coherent song. It's about something. And that's important. He could take with him a lot of people who weren't dance fans just because it's a coherent song. And secondly is he has this androgynous character, which he'd always had, but is particularly appropriate for disco in the late 70s. Disco really did spring out of the gay and Puerto Rican clubs, and it was a flamboyant music. Being a dance-based movement, it favored people who looked good and could move well. Well, this is something that Jagger had already done. He proved he could do this in the 60s. And he could be gay without scaring straight people. And the reason he could be gay without scaring straight people was because he was so sexualized. He covered more of the prism than your average person. And so he would naturally incorporate elements of this into his artistry and sound convincing doing it, which is very important because you don't want to think he's a tourist. But even though he's sounding convincing, he's not at all disturbing.
When I left Europe, I remember going back to New York, and my little brother, who's like, you know, hardcore Harlemite kid, you know, from the hood, in the hood, all about the hood, and he was saying, Jimmy, because that's the name my mom called me, gave me when I was born, said, man, you got to hear this record by the Rolling Stones, man. He said, man, they got some bad harmonica player on there, man. You got to hear this, man. You're going to love this. I was like, yeah, he's pretty good. and you know, but when he told me this story, after I finished laughing and telling him it was me, it dawned on me how powerful a tune that this song was, that it even made inroads into the heart of the black community.
I don't know how anyone can not like Miss You. It's just one of the most incredibly vibrant pop singles of the 70s. Miss You was the first Stones masterpiece for a long time in the singles market, I think. Especially the 12-inch pink vinyl version, which just went on, and often those 12 inches were just awful. But this one, the riff was so good, that beautiful texture of the sugar blue, his harmonica, the guy they found in the streets of Paris, Jagger's vocals, and Mick and Bill and Charlie right up front with the rhythm section. It was just such a warm, up-tempo, lively. This is the Stones not trying to be punk, keeping up with the punks. It was doing something different, and actually it won them more fans by doing that than trying to out-punk the punk bands, which would have been a bit silly, really. It was a masterstroke.
Yet there was a punk influence on some girls, albeit not from those British bands that had been laughing at the Stones' excesses 2 years beforehand. The New York punk scene, which was inspired by a more conceptual approach to art and music, had as its forebears Andy Warhol and the band he helped launch, the Velvet Underground. Having developed in the early 70s through acts such as the New York Dolls and Suicide, it emerged as a recognizable movement in 1974, when young bands began to appear at the Lower East Side club CBGB. By 77, figureheads Patti Smith, Television, the Ramones and Blondie had all become underground celebrities, poised for mainstream success. And it was this raw and streetwise world that Jagger and the Stones managed to channel with Some Girls.
In America, much more so than in England, punk was an aesthetic movement. It wasn't particularly a political movement. And in America, it also was a kind of neoclassical movement. You know, I heard Richard Hell and the Voidoids cover Ventilator Blues by the Rolling Stones, for example. You know, Patti Smith worshipped the Rolling Stones, you know, looked like Keith Richards. So that sense of the Rolling Stones being the enemy was much more an English thing. It wasn't what was going on in New York. The Stones still had a kind of currency here. So they could tap into punk and they could tap into disco. On a track like Shattered, they can even tap into a little bit of hip-hop, you know, and Jagger sort of, you know, semi-rapping on the track. And, you know, all of that was kind of credible, and all of that was, you know, part of the Stones' world.
In society, we don't worry about the things that we used to be. We're talking heroin with the president, 'cause it's a problem, sir, and it can't be banned.
Insofar as Jagger was inspired by New York, what he was inspired was by upper crust New York. Did Mick ever go to CBGB? Is there any record of his going to CBGB? I never heard about it. I think I would have. Now, that doesn't mean that Some Girls doesn't in some kind of way reflect the punk, but it could have reflected it anywhere. I mean, all you had to do is listen to the records, read the stories, and think, hey, maybe I should do this. Now, maybe I should get a little rootsy again, or whatever he said to himself. Rootsy would not have been the word. But get raw, right? Become more raw. And I think in that respect, Some Girls, which has its disco song, also has its punk feel. But I don't think that living in New York, in my opinion, was at all essential for that to happen. It was aesthetic, not cultural.
It hasn't got the awkwardness of British punk. You know, it hasn't got the subway sec, the sort of almost hopping element of punk. But it's got this trad rock punk, which is more in keeping, I think, with what you heard in CBGB's and Max's Kansas City. And it's got the energy. I mean, a wonderful raw kind of energy on most of the tracks on there. But it's a rock and rolling punk album as opposed to a sort of wooden peg-legged punk album that we would have got from London. And the closest thing to it in Britain, I think, was the Clash's Give 'Em Enough Rope, which was trying to be American, with Sandy Perlman producing it. They were almost two of a kind, and the Clash were going one way, traitors to the punk cause, I think, and then you've got the Stones who are trying to meeting it in the middle, but, you know, by far the more acceptable album, I would say.
Life's just a cut to morning on the street. Just a black bad, direct your chair.
album's final track, Shattered, which there's no blue notes in there. I mean, that's the Stones really embracing, not necessarily punk, but new wave, Talking Heads and bands like that which are coming out of the New York clubs with a slightly different twist on things. You know, this isn't Johnny Thunders, this is something with a bit more of an interesting sheen going on. So, glossy, there's a glossiness, as well as, you know, as we're back to basics with the raw guitars up front. There was this new wave sheen there that was very much flavour of the time, and also what was going to happen over the next couple of years.
For the most part, you know, punk and all of those New York bands, you know, the Patti Smith Group and Television and Richard Hell and the Voidoids and the Ramones even, you know, that was a kind of critical phenomenon in the United States. Those records really did not make much of a commercial impact till a little bit later. Even as they were chronicling a certain aspect of what New York was, that was appealing to people in New York, you know, who were moving in kind of those circles and going to CBGB and going to the Mud Club. To people in Iowa, you know, that was not registering. But, you know, with the Rolling Stones, you know, they were on the radio. You know, they were doing a big tour. You know, Some Girls was a big record. So their story of what was happening in New York got out there. And it helped New York, by the way. You know, that really, it certainly bolstered spirits here. And, you know, it made New York seem really hip.
And in keeping with this mutual love affair between Jagger and the city, at the close of 1978, the Stones were invited onto the 4th season of New York's hit comedy show, Saturday Night Live. Not only did they perform 2 tracks, but Mick also appeared alongside Dan Aykroyd in a parody of The Tom Snyder Show.
My guest tonight is a man who's familiar to anybody who owns a hi-fi set. He's a member of the pop group The Rolling Stones, and his name is Mr. Mick Jagger. I just want to say that when they told me that you were doing the show, I was frankly quite apprehensive. You know, I'd heard you were a little bit of a cut-up, a kind of a hellion. I don't know what kind of hijinks to expect from guys like you, but here you are, you're a well-behaved young man, and frankly, sir, I am surprised.
Well, Tom, thank you. That's nice of you. You know, before I came here, I heard a few things about you, and I heard you were slow and a bit thick. You know, a kind of a dim bulb. But now I met you, you know, I know you can't help it.
Well, thank you very much, sir. You're welcome back anytime. We've been talking with...
Excuse me, Tom, one thing, you know, before we finish up this...
Anything at all, sir.
Is that through this entire interview, one thing has fascinated me. Yes, sir? It's the extraordinary variety of colors in your hair. I mean, there must be at least 12. I mean, there's gray and black and blue and a little green. You must be aware of that.
Green? I didn't know about the spot of green, Mick, to be quite honest with you. Join us tomorrow on Tomorrow, when we'll be talking with a group of beef farmers who claim that Elvis Presley's ghost is responsible for a mysterious series of aerial cattle mutilations in the Midwest. Good night, everybody.
With a hit record behind them and a major US tour underway, the band's return to relevance continued apace with the signing of reggae artist Peter Tosh to Rolling Stones Records. This label had never made any real effort to support or nourish other talent, and instead served only the Stones and their side projects. Yet with Tosh, they made an exception. Previously a member of the legendary Wailers, he had been instrumental in introducing ex-bandmate Bob Marley to music, yet was a far more controversial figure. Released shortly after Some Girls, Tosh's first album for the label, Bush Doctor, featured contributions from Jagger and Richards, who were both keen to align themselves with such an edgy musical artist.
I thought it was great when the Stones signed Peter Tosh to their label. All of these monster bands at the time were starting their own labels, and my recollection is, by and large, they played pretty safe. I mean, Led Zeppelin started Swan Song, and who did they sign? The Pretty Things and Bad Company. You know, so the Stones are kind of not exactly going out on a limb, but they're being a lot more adventurous in signing someone like Peter Tosh, and just the very fact of kind of raising their sights beyond the Anglo-American rock and roll tradition, I thought was great.
Just your problems and no one else's problems. You have to bear. So if you just put your hand in mine, we're gonna leave all your troubles behind. We're gonna walk and don't look back.
Tosh gave the Rolling Stones label a bit of edge because, you know, I mean, Bob Marley was the middle-of-the-road moderate compared to Tosh. I mean, I think when they signed him, Jagger and Richards flew out to Jamaica to see him perform. I think it was probably the famous, you know, peace concert with Manley and Seaga, the two Jamaican politicians. You know, and there's Tosh on stage, taunting the police and the politicians with a big spliff in his hand, and you know, I mean, he was almost the you know, the gangster figure in the Harder They Come.
Legalize me. Don't criticize. Legalize. Yeah, yeah, I will advertise it.
Keith, we know, had and still has a genuine love for Jamaica, its people and its music. I think Mick enjoyed the music and also saw its kind of hip cachet as well. He then, of course, sang on the single from the first Tosh album on Rolling Stones records, Temptations number, Keep on Walking, Don't Look Back. Well, I mean, it was a great choice of a song because, in actual fact, the Wailers as a vocal trio in the 60s had kind of started out as a Jamaican copy of American soul vocal groups like the Temptations. I think Tosh may even have recorded or at least sung the song, you know, a decade earlier.
Just put your hand in mine. We're gonna leave all our troubles behind. We're gonna walk and don't look back. Don't look back. Walk and don't look back. Don't look back. Ooh. Behind you. When your lover lets you down, something can be done.
It sounded like a good record. I mean, I thought Jagger did a pretty okay job on that, bearing in mind that only 2 years earlier, Cherry O Baby, you know, was a bit of a stub toe into the reggae water. It's strange. In 1972, they went down, winter 72, they went down to Byron Lee's studio, Dynamic Sound Studios, for Goat's Head Soup. And it's weird because they came back from Kingston, Jamaica, without a great deal of reggae on that record. You know, they threw themselves right in the middle of it. And there wasn't really much, but slowly it did seep its way through. Luxury on It's Only Rock and Roll, Jagger doing his patois star vocal as well, Cherry O Baby, and then Mick coming up with Tosh in 78, who was, you know, one of the great Wailers, and just about holding his own on the record, I think.
While Jagger was stepping out on Saturday Night Live to appear with Tosh, by the end of the year, both Keith Richards and Ronnie Wood were concentrating on side projects. In December 78, Richards' first solo single, the Chuck Berry cover Run, Rudolph, Run, was issued. Evidence that the recovering guitarist was trying to focus on music to distract himself from the lure of heroin. It also showed that despite the Stones' recent attempts to modernize their sound, Richard's heart still lay in the blues and classic rock and roll. The following year, Ronnie Wood's solo LP, Gimme Some Neck, was released, and he formed the touring band The New Barbarians to support the album. As a result of the final judgment passed in Canada on Keith Richards, the guitarist was ordered to play a benefit concert for the National Institute for the Blind, and he joined the New Barbarians not only at that concert, but also on their US tour in late April '79 and at the Nebworth Fair in August.
I was just looking for something to do. What I do best? I know I play guitar in a rock and roll band, you know. So where's the nearest one? Ronnie's. And Ronnie's always there when you need him, quite usually inadvertently. But it's that usual mystical timing, you know. He had this thing going, and I said, oh, sure, man, I come. Yeah. So just did it.
In many ways is a kind of traditional musician who likes to be out there playing. And this thing with the Stones, you know, maybe we'll go out in 3 years, you know, maybe we'll go out in 5 years. You know, I think that was really beginning to take its toll on him. He wasn't doing very well, by the way, with those long periods of inactivity. And so I think, you know, latching onto Ron Wood and pulling the New Barbarians together and getting out on the road, you know, was one way to try to deal with that. But in many ways, it suggested, it was suggestive of some of the issues that were going on within the band itself.
She's still the only one you really love. I said yesterday, trying to score an easy leg. You're the one you need. You're the one you need. I know what it is you want.
I would assume that by the late 70s, Mick's being in Manhattan with Bianca at Studio 54 was troubling to Keith. I think it didn't make him like this guy anymore. And, you know, mates like that, they often have their problems. I mean, the fact that they've been able to stay together in any form is remarkable. And we're not talking about Sam and Dave or the Everly Brothers here. You know, it's not like they're at each other's throats and just completely faking it when they get on the stage. It's that they have their differences and their distance, but they're still bandmates and happy to do that. And so I would assume that Keith very much is feeling the need for all kinds of outlets. I mean, there is also the fact, of course, that he's a junkie and Mick isn't, and junkies actually like to hang out with other addicts. Addicts really like other addicts. So that would probably be another thing, and not so kind to Keith in that particular case. Yeah, to a certain Keith has always been amazingly unpretentious. I give him that every time. And his solo albums are actually somewhat better than Mick's, albeit not quite as good as his fans say they are. But he definitely had to have some serious misgivings about Mick's lifestyle. It just is not the way he wanted to live. And so sure, he sought outlets. He always has. He's been doing it for a long time.
And those outlets were able to distract Richards from the tensions at the heart of his relationship with Jagger. Unable to contribute strongly to the Stones' direction over the previous few years, in 1979 a recovering Richards was looking to become a more active participant in the production of their latest offering, Emotional Rescue. Yet he found he was out of kilter with Jagger's pursuit of the latest trends, and their strained partnership was evident on the resultant album. Released in June 1980, it was a commercial success, yet disappointed many listeners.
I don't think that there was any question that when Keith really began, certainly with his arrest in Toronto and the prospect of his possibly going to jail, his drug problems, being a drug addict. I think there's no question that Mick Jagger decided, either I take the reins here or this band falls apart. I think that's what a lot of what people forget in terms of seeing Jagger. Oh, he's a control freak or whatever. It was like, if this band was going to get from Monday to Tuesday to Wednesday to Thursday, somebody had to be behind the wheel. And, Jagger just decided, all right, I'll get behind the wheel. Around the time of Emotional Rescue, Keith is trying to, well, okay, I'm back, I'm relatively clean, let's get moving. It's like, well, where have you been for the last 6 years? But if you listen to it now, Emotional Rescue, you could find things that are kind of interesting about it. It's in many ways so forgettable. There's an element of, not even going through the motions. It just doesn't quite rise to the level of going through the motions. It is kind of, just sense of a complete absence of ideas. It's like, the Rolling Stones, step up a little bit here.
After Miss You, which had just roared out of the speakers and onto the dance floor, Emotional Rescue was just a much more muted, dance floor song, and it just didn't have that sense of occasion or element of surprise even. They were treading water, I think, already by this stage.
Yes, you could be mine tonight and every night. I will be your knight in shining armor, coming to your emotional rescue.
Emotional Rescue is a real amber warning light because it is forgettable. Outside of the title song, which is a huge hit, it's not really worth talking about. Because everything that's done well is something they've already done well.
It sounds like a mess, it was Some Girls Part 2, but weaker in almost every way. There's a track called Summer Romance, which was almost like a parody of Respect, or a bad version of Respectable. There was Where the Boys Go, which was like a poor man's Members, which really isn't saying too much. It was all over the place. It was a bit odds and sods. Right down, and even the cover was lukewarm. Everything about it was lukewarm. And after Some Girls, it was very disappointing. Interestingly enough, when they promoted that album, Jagger said something like, there's no future left in rock and roll. And, when you're listening to that record, you think, he's got that one right.
I'm so up for her, I'm so up for her, I'm so up for her, she's so cold. I'm so up for her, I'm on fire for her, I'm so up for her, she's so cold. I'm the burning bush, I'm the burning fire, I'm the bleeding volcano.
By Emotional Rescue, the Stones really are struggling. The material is weak. She's So Cold is possibly the most tepid single they've ever released. My recollection when the album came out, in fact throughout this sort of period of the Stones, is that people fell into two camps really. There were those who were willing the Stones to make another great album, and so were over-eager with every new release to claim some kind of return to form. And there were those who'd already written the Stones off and just used each new release as further evidence to their argument belief that the band were already a busted flush. Truth probably lies somewhere in the middle.
After Some Girls, Emotional Rescue just sort of feels so just like half-assed and unconvincing. It doesn't feel like Keith was fully present for the record. I mean, he has said that All About You was sort of the only thing that he could really put his name to or lay credit to, that he did that separately. Mick was not involved with it. It's the only really decent song on the record for me. It's the beginning of those great Keith songs that often finish Stones albums. There's a sort of run of them, and I just think they're great. It's the soulful Keith Richards. It's the Keith who still feels music in a way that Mick apparently doesn't anymore. You know, Mick just tosses things off in a rather glib way, whether he's doing a kind of hard rocker, whether he's doing the cod reggae thing on Send It To Me, whether he's singing Where the Boys Go, or whether he's doing the kind of funk thing. It just feels like Mick putting on this hat now, and then he'll put on that hat, and it's just so insincere. Lester Bangs said that Black and Blue was the first Stones album that was officially meaningless, but I don't think it is meaningless compared to this. This is the first record where you just feel it is pure contractual obligation, with the exception of All About You.
After the return to form of Some Girls and the revitalising of the band's energy through Ron Wood, by 1981, the Stones were in trouble. While holding sessions for another album, a number of band meetings took place across May and June in New York City regarding their future. Richards, on holiday with his new partner Patty Hansen, failed to show up at the majority of these, and midway through discussions, Charlie Watts declared that the band was finished. At the heart of the issue were the conflicting interests of Mick and Keith, and these would eventually engulf the entire band.
The great feud between Jagger and Richards ought to be something that only they can tell you what went on. However, it was fought out in public in almost every interview from the time, so we can draw some pretty accurate conclusions about what was happening. I mean, it seems that Jagger has some difficulty dealing with a functional Keith again. Allegedly, Jagger at one point turns around and says to somebody, I wish he'd just go back to being a junkie again because he was much less trouble then. So that's the roots of it. It then gets exacerbated by a whole number of issues, both musical, personal, and social as well, really. Musically, Keith has this view, which I have some sympathy for, that Jagger is by this point chasing trends, and he believes that the Stones always set trends, and if they're no longer setting trends, they should just at least continue in the trend that they set way back when, rather than, you know, chasing every kind of ephemeral fad of pop fashion. Socially, he's pretty much out of sympathy with the world that Jagger is now moving in. At this point, there are two worlds. There's the Stones world and there's Mick's world, and he feels very alienated from that kind of high society thing. Mick, to try to be fair to him and see it from his point of view, he's running the Rolling Stones as this multi-million-pound corporation with this vast number of employees and so on and so forth. And Keith's turning up to meetings and sort of sitting there flicking his ratchet knife and, as I say, the bottle of vodka in the other hand. So you've got this partnership that has endured so well and made the Rolling Stones what it is, and it's reached the point where one half of the partnership is sitting there with its sort of appointments diary in one hand and its calculator in the other, and the other one's got a bottle of vodka and a switchblade.
Yet amidst this breakdown, the band managed to bounce back from the disappointment of emotional rescue. Back in September 1980, producer Chris Kimsey had delved into the archives to listen to rejected or half-completed songs from Goat's Head Soup onwards, and had showed his discoveries to the band. With a US tour planned for late 1981, the band, and Jagger in particular, had spent time adding elements to these tracks and formed an original album to promote their live shows. On its release in 1981, Tattoo U's mixture of styles and sounds attracted glowing reviews and strong sales. Its lead single, a track originally recorded as a reggae number with a crucial take done in the band's inimitable late 60s style, was key to the album's success, Start Me Up.
When Start Me Up came out, there was general rejoicing. This is the Rolling Stones. It was the first classic Keith intro in years. I mean, you want to hear that intro again and again and again.
Start Me Up is top 5, top 10 in their entire output. And not as well as, of course, the theme song of what they have been for 30 years. It's such a great song. To me, that's the difference between Mick and Keith. Mick is actually the person with the conceptual grasp. You want to know how smart he is? He was smart enough to decide that they should do a classic Stones track and it should say this at this time, and that there was a reason it didn't work as a reggae track. I think we're very lucky they didn't do it as a reggae track. Because then it's just a song about sex or something. Now it's a song about their lives. And that's typical of what Mick is like at his best. Is he always at his best? No, of course not. Nobody's always at their best. But right there, that's why Mick is a great rock and roll artist.
There's a lot of terrific things about, Tattoo You. I mean, I think that Chris Kimsey went and found all this stuff, but the Stones still worked on those tracks. I mean, Mick Jagger has said, look, there were things that we had worked on, but the reason they didn't get on records is a lot of them weren't finished. I had to write melodies, I had to write lyrics, how to do new vocals. Obviously, these things were not just things that were, pulled wholly formed from the vaults. Tattoo You had to be put together pretty quickly. The Stones had decided they were going to go on tour. Having things that they had worked on, sort of presented to them, precluded the process of them trying too hard. Again, which I always think is the thing that sinks them when they sink. It's not too fancy, and it's not trying too hard, and it's not just kind of looking around and figuring out, gee, what's happening this minute, and let's try to emulate it. It's as if, you were kind of skimming the top off the period. I mean, even as, the 70s, was not necessarily the Stones' high point. If you skim the 2 or 3 best tracks on all those records, you have a pretty good collection of stuff. And, in a certain way, that's what Tattoo You became.
Waiting for a Friend, very easy to interpret it in the light of the Jagger-Richards feud, and I think they actually play upon that in the video for it, which I think Michael Lindsay Hogg shot. I mean, the song itself goes all the way back to Goat's Head Soup. I don't know what portion or to what extent the lyrics date back to that album, but the music certainly does. But I mean, it's clear from the video that Mick and Keith were aware of the implications that could be read into this song, and sure, that gives it an extra frisson. It's strange. This is an album made up of old tracks, and then I think Jagger writes some new lyrics and obviously does the vocals and so on and so forth. But the end result is a superior album to those for which this material was originally written.
If the Stones album was widely praised, their mammoth US tour and the 1982 European tour divided audiences. For some, these record-breaking shows were the group's best in years, playing colossal arenas and confirming their position as the world's greatest rock and roll band. For others, it was the end point of the Stones' move from musicians to entertainers, the culmination of every shallow and questionable aspect of the group that the punks had criticized only 5 years beforehand.
There was a sense of the band having more confidence on stage. I mean, it was not as good, I don't think, a show as they would later do. I mean, and, Keith, when he was battling with Mick later, very famously said, we don't need the lemon yellow tights and we don't need the cherry picker. Talking about the Rolling Stones, Jagger going up on this cherry picker and wearing this kind of odd football outfit, American football, with these lemon yellow tights and a kind of jersey with a number on it. That said, I mean, I think the Stones sounded better, and I think they had gotten used to now being on these large stages. I think Ron Wood was a more integrated part of the band on stage, for those shows. They would not go out on the road again for 8 years, by the way. I mean, the issues that were just in the horizon for them were just kind of looming. But, at that point, I think everybody was excited to have them out there, and they were doing a pretty good job of it.
I went to see the Stones in '82, they did the American tour in '81 and then '82. I saw them at Wembley. It was just the most wretched thing, it was just musically horrible. And it was just all about Jagger wearing these utterly bizarre and grotesque sort of like sports leotards with kind of elbow pads, and God knows what he was thinking, but running up and down these endless runaways. I mean, Charlie Watts said that, at that time, he wouldn't see Jagger for 5 minutes. How can you play like that? He couldn't even see his lead singer. It really was so depressing, and the band was so untogether, and everything was played slightly too fast, and just nothing had any coherence to it. And so, even though I thought Start Me Up was okay and Waiting on a Friend was okay, I just really gave up on the Stones at that point. I really did. I just gave up on them.
The band's final show of the European tour in July 1982 would be their last bona fide concert for 7 years. Just as some fans were now tiring of the Stones' metamorphosis into a corporate machine, internally tensions had continued to grow. Yet despite their differences, in November they did return to Paris to begin work on new material. Almost a year later, the first single from these sessions emerged, Undercover of the Night. Often still accused of working on autopilot, Jagger again proved that he was taking music seriously and provided his first political lyrics since the late 60s, this time focusing on the US-backed right-wing regimes and death squads in Central and South America. Yet despite the controversial subject matter, it was only a moderate success.
It's not so much a return to Jagger writing about politics, because he hardly ever wrote about politics. You know, the street fighting man stands out, and sympathy for the devil perhaps to a lesser extent. But it's virtually new territory for him. He's clearly aroused by what is going on in Central and Southern America and how it's become a new theatre for the Cold War to be played out, and in particular for the kind of duplicity and hypocrisy of what the Americans are doing there. And I think it's a tremendously brave track. One of the things that Jagger is doing on this album is telling stories. You know? I mean, there's another song about this horrendous story from Paris about this Japanese guy who kills and eats his girlfriend. And that is, you know, this kind of newspaper story style of writing. But on the track Undercover, he's clearly doing something else. You know, it's not a newspaper report of what's going on. He's taking sides in there. You know, there are lines there about these dirty little G.I. Joes and so on and so forth. So it was a brave song to write.
Undercover of the Night is fabulous. And it certainly keeps Keith fans happy. Some great work by Keith on that. But also Mick wrote a very serious song. So certainly, at that time, Ronald Reagan's support for some of the right-wing death squads in Latin America was controversial. And Jagger talks about it. It was a high-quality song, but it wasn't remotely lyrically commercial. Who wants to hear about a controversial part of a popular president's foreign policy? It's the first time the Stones have really felt not just older, but old. And it's unfortunate it should have happened to them on a good record. But that was the year when all of these groups of the Second British Invasion happened at the same time. Wham! With George Michael and Andrew Ridgeley, Spandau Ballet, Duran Duran, Culture Club with Boy George. And so suddenly the Rolling Stones are clearly for adults, not for young people.
Released in November 1983, into this new marketplace dominated by a fresh generation of mainstream acts, the album Undercover failed to ignite the charts. Reaching only number 4 in the US, it broke a streak of 8 consecutive #1 studio albums. And even in that less progressive marketplace, the band finally seemed to be losing their commercial hold. In the modern musical climate, the Stones seemed decidedly old hat.
Later Rolling Stones records like Undercover, I mean, the issue finally becomes production. Some of the production trends of the 1980s in particular are very identifiable, you know, to this day. I mean, if you listen to a Hall & Oates record from back then, you know, Hall & Oates made a lot of great songs, but, you know, to hear them now, you're just kind of going, you know, it bothers you, you know, it's just, you're trying too hard. You know, there was a concern about getting on the radio. there was a sense of, MTV coming along and altering the landscape in that way, and, how are we relevant now to this new generation? And, the Stones are at their best, I think, when they trust themselves and don't worry about that stuff too much, and I think you can hear them on Undercover, on that album in particular, worrying about that stuff.
Undercover was a mixing desk album. It wasn't a Mick and Keith album. It was a mixing desk album. It really did seem like old people playing with young people's toys, and they were clueless. I don't think they particularly liked the new music, but they felt this is all they can do. They're all the Bowies, the Jaggers, the Neil Youngs, the Dylans. They couldn't really do much else. They had to keep relevant in some ways. And you can sense that they don't really like what they're doing, I don't think. And I just get the sense that they're not in the studio, they're just handing it over to a bank of engineers who will then we'll make it modern for you. It was really that. It felt that cynical, it sounded that cynical, and I'm pretty sure it was that cynical.
Still trying to compete with modern acts, in this case artists like Michael Jackson and Prince, with the singles for this album, the Stones bravely entered the new world of MTV. Yet their appeal to a younger audience was limited, and the follow-up to Undercover of the Night, She Was Hot, failed to hit the top 40 on either side of the Atlantic.
She kissed me now, she was as a wife to brown. She pinned me to the ground. She knew her way around. She was hot, and she tore my clothes. She was hot, she had no place to go. She was hot, I'm going raining.
She Was Hot becomes the first single not to make the top 40, which I suspect caused Jagger some soul-searching. The Stones are now moving away from that youth market. It's very difficult for teenagers the singles buying public, to relate to these guys who are now, 40 years old. In the same way that when the Stones and the Beatles appeared in the early 60s, the people who bought their records weren't listening to Elvis Presley and Jerry Lee Lewis and Chuck Berry. I remember as a kid in the 1960s, and I thought people like Chuck Berry and Jerry Lee Lewis were, as old as my grandparents. They weren't, of course. You look back and you realise they were only in their mid-30s, probably. So very hard for a kind of single-buying teenage market to relate to these old guys in their 40s. Jagger, of course, still wants to relate to all these young girls on the dance floor, and that's probably why he moves off in the direction of the solo career, and She's the Boss, and he's trying to reinvent the young Lothario figure, and possibly he realises he's not going to be able to make that reinvention at this point in the context of the band.
Yet that reinvention would be impossible in any context. Despite signing a 4-album deal with CBS in 1983 for a record $28 million, like many of the other iconic acts of the 1960s, for the Stones, the 1980s was a nightmare decade. With the internal battles between Jagger and Richards escalating, the greatest rock and roll band in the world fell apart at the seams.
It's catastrophic. Mick tries to reinvent himself as a solo artist and shed the baggage of the Stones, which of course he can't do. Keith's problems are very well documented. Bill Wyman goes completely off the rails, chasing a 13-year-old girl who he ends up marrying. I think she's probably 16 by the time of the nuptials, but it all started when she was 13 and he's, 45 or whatever. And dear old Charlie Watts, who has never had anything to do with the drug side of the Rolling Stones, suddenly in middle age decides to become a heroin addict. So just a horrible period for them. Ronnie Wood is in and out of rehab. And it really couldn't have been worse. Fortunately, they survive it and come out the other side, probably no longer able to make great records, and that's where they reinvent themselves as the greatest live rock and roll band in the world, just playing the old hits.
Actually, there was life after Undercover. It was not the end. It was not the end. There were things that lay up ahead that showed that there was still some. When they were bothered to sit down and work hard and re-establish contact with their muse, they could still pull something out of a hat.
Yet the period of activity between 1975 and 1983 remains their last significant era as a recording act. Despite criticisms that they were both chasing trends and treading water, they nevertheless experimented, found fresh sources of inspiration, and succeeded in producing lasting music that will continue to be discovered by new generations of fans.
I think in terms of how good the music is, they were dealing with impossibly inflated expectations that nobody could have fulfilled. And that, in retrospect, their craft got them through, as did their willingness to experiment, which happens even on Black and Blue, even if the experiment was forced on them. The level of craft means that they produce a more than respectable body of songs and enduring music. So I think that this output, dismissed though it is a pretty impressive testament to how good they are.
I think it's fair to say that, Some Girls and Tattoo You were probably the last two Rolling Stones albums that really kind of, fully address the moment, are important records that are about that time, and also, find the Rolling Stones kind of driving some of the things that are going on rather than sort of chasing them. Past that point, it seems almost as if the Rolling Stones kind of live in their own universe. They make a record, whatever, 3 or 5 years. There's almost always good things on those records. Are those records that shape that time, define it? Not really. But, are they quality, listenable albums? For the most part, they are. The Stones as a live band, to me, still are terrifically exciting. In a funny way, that is a kind of relevance. But, as far as, the songs, a track like Start Me Up or a track like Miss You, that really seems to both be timeless and so much of its time. The Stones have not been able to do that really since then.